female, so I think, and that's a real-ish, but it's a real thing. The best thing I could have done to prove to so many people that didn't want my mom to have a daughter was to become Superwoman.
What up, everyone? It's your girl, Superwoman.
It was the name of Lily's favorite hip-hop song by Lil Mo featuring Fabulous.
I love the song so much because it was one of the only songs at the time that was an empowering female song, where Lil Mo's going on about, like, I will save guys with my superpowers, and I will save girls with my superpowers, and I am the Superwoman. I thought, this name that I've had for so long that empowered me when I was younger, I'm gonna make this my screen name.
Maybe this should be a new series.
Superwoman didn't just burst onto the scene overnight with a viral video. It was a steady climb fueled by hard work.
The moment that I thought this is going somewhere and this could be a career was the first time I performed internationally. It was in India. And it was the first time where I was truly across the world and people knew my videos.
Singh has transformed herself from a bratty kid to an internet personality to a media mogul. She starred in a feature film, A Trip to Unicorn Island, in 2016. And her book, How to Be a Boss, hit the New York Times bestseller list in 2017 while she was on a 30-city international tour. Lily started out with the goal of getting millions of subscribers and financial security.
Hurry the hell up!
But after surpassing those goals, success has new meaning.
I've really come to terms with the fact that my definition of success is what's the best legacy I can leave behind. And it's not the number of views and the number of subscribers. It is the number of people that can say, this girl changed my life or changed something in my life positively.
CTE is often found in the brains of deceased athletes, military veterans, and others with a history.
The minority to suppress a point of view? Will the Senate then have to deal with constant articles of impeachment by a majority party accusing minority presidents or other elected officials of so-called insightful or false speeches? You can see where this would lead. Sadly, we have all seen the political rhetoric get ratcheted up over the last few years. We've all been witnesses to many incendiary words by our officials at political events, broadcast over the media, internet. In each of those instances, will there now be Senate impeachment hearings? One last observation. We agree with the House managers, context does indeed matter. The inflammatory rhetoric from our elected officials must be considered as part of the larger context of Mr. Trump's speech at the Ellipse on January 6th. The inflammatory language from both sides of the aisle has been alarming, frankly. But this political discourse must be considered as part of these proceedings to contextualize Mr. Trump's words. We have some video to play that highlights some of what I'm talking about. I preface this video by noting I am not showing you this video as some excuse for Mr. Trump's speech. This is not whataboutism. I am showing you this to make the point that all political speech must be protected.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country. Maybe there will be.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
You got to be ready to throw a punch. Well, you have to be ready to throw a punch.
Donald Trump, I think you need to go back and punch him in the face.
That I thought he should have punched him in the face.
I feel like punching him.
I'd like to take him behind the gym if I were in high school. If we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
No, I wish we were in high school. I could take him behind the gym.
I will go and take Trump out tonight.
Take him out now.
Okay.
When was the last time an actor assassinated a president?
They're still going to have to go out and put a bullet in Donald Trump.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
I have thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House.
Please, get up in the face of some Congress people.
People will do what they do.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price.
We're going to go in there, we're going to...
This is just a warning to you Trumpers. Be careful. Walk lightly. And for those of you who are soldiers, make them pay.
If you had to be stuck in an elevator with either President Trump, Mike Pence, or Jeff Sessions, who would it be?
Does one of us have to come out alive?
Again, I did not show you their robust speech to excuse or balance out the speech of my client, for I need not. I showed you the video because in this political forum, all robust speech should be protected, and it should be protected evenly for all of us. As a brief aside, we should all reflect and acknowledge the rhetoric has gotten to be too much and over the top. It is grating on the collective well-being of the body politic, the citizens. Most would like it to stop. But the point is, when you see speech such as this, you have to apply the First Amendment evenly, blindly. She is blind, Lady Justice. Question 1. Does the First Amendment apply to this chamber in these proceedings? The House manager's position, as stated in their trial brief, is, and I quote, "The First Amendment does not apply at all to an impeachment proceeding. That's their position. This is plainly wrong. The text of the First Amendment expressly restricts Congress from regulating speech. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. To ignore the Constitution would be contrary to the oath of office of a United States Senator. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Well, you all know the rest. No, the Senate cannot ignore the First Amendment. The Constitution itself limits the ability of the House to impeach in limited items, such as high crimes and misdemeanors. The position advanced by the House managers is essentially an unlimited impeachment standard without constitutional guardrails, unmoored to any specific legal test other than the unbridled discretion of Congress. This is distinctly not the intent of the framers. The framers were aware of the danger of any impeachment process that would make the president the mere creature of the legislature, a quote directly from the framers while debating the impeachment process on the floor of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The framers were fearful that any impeachment process that gave Congress full discretion on the standard for impeachment would constitute nothing less than a violation, quote, a violation of the fundamental principle of good government. One founding father, James Wilson, wrote extensively on the impeachment process. Mr. Wilson was a renowned legal scholar at the time, a law professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. He was a major force in drafting and adopting the Constitution in 1787. He served as one of the first six Supreme Court justices, 1789 to 1798. He was appointed by President George Washington. In fact, Wilson taught the first course on the new Constitution to President Washington and his cabinet, the first in the nation's history, in Philadelphia, at the University of Pennsylvania in 1789. Wilson, in his law lectures, the first of their kind under the Constitution, plainly states that the Senate may not ignore the Constitution in impeachment proceedings. He states that lawful and constitutional conduct may not be used as an impeachable offense. Let me say that again. He states that lawful and constitutional conduct may not be used as an impeachable offense. Read along with me. The doctrine of impeachments is of high import in the constitutions of free states. On one hand, the most powerful magistrate should be amenable to the law. On the other hand, elevated characters should not be sacrificed merely on account of their elevation. No one should be secure while he violates the Constitution and the laws. Everyone should be secure while he observes them. To be clear, James Wilson is saying that the Constitution does indeed apply when judging whether to convict an official by impeachment. If the complaint of conduct is constitutional, it cannot be impeachable. Are we to ignore the words and teachings of James Wilson? The House managers surely want you to. The House managers have made several references to this letter, signed by 140 partisan law professors, calling Mr. Trump's First Amendment defense legally frivolous. This is really an outrageous attempt to intimidate Mr. Trump's lawyers. Whenever a lawyer advances a truly frivolous argument, they may violate professional ethical rules and could be subject to discipline. This letter is a direct threat to my law license, my career, and my family's financial well-being. These law professors should be ashamed of themselves, and so should the House managers. How dare you? Do you really hate Donald Trump so much that you're willing to destroy good, hard-working people's lives, people that are only doing their jobs, and frankly, as counsel for an accused fulfilling a constitutional role? It's astounding, really. I'm a citizen, not a politician. I know these First Amendment arguments are not anywhere close to frivolous. They are completely meritorious. Interestingly, the law professor's letter was issued on February 5th, 3 days before we even filed our legal brief in this matter, and they ignored landmark, bedrock Supreme Court cases directly addressing this issue. In our brief, we have a direct quote from James Wilson, the founding father, supporting our position. The direct quote was documented in the founding father's original legal papers. Do I have those with me? On the subject. He was the primary draftsman of the Constitution who taught the new Constitution to President Washington. He says so long as acts of elected officials like Mr. Trump are constitutionally protected, he should not be impeached. We have landmark U.S. Supreme Court decisions, Wood and Bonds, which I'll explain in detail, supporting our position. All of this the House managers and the partisan law professors completely and misleadingly ignore. Frivolous? Hardly. The letter is a bully tactic, and I think evidence is the House managers know they have a problem with the First Amendment defense on the merits, so they're resorting to such tactics. The House manager's suggestion that the First Amendment does not apply to this impeachment process is completely untenable. Ignoring the First Amendment would conflict with the senator's oath of office. It would also conflict with well-settled Supreme Court precedent and ignore the intent of the framers of the Constitution, such as James Wilson. Above all else, ignoring the Constitution would adopt the new Raskin common sense doctrine we heard yesterday, eroding hundreds of years of First Amendment protections. We are here under the Constitution. It is illogical what the House managers say. The Constitution does apply to this constitutional impeachment process. It's double talk, nonsense, illogical. If the House managers had their way, they would ignore all of the Constitution. Does that include the Sixth Amendment? The right to counsel? They would have Mr. Trump sitting here without lawyers. And who would be next? It could be anyone. One of you. Or one of you. You must reject this invitation to ignore the First Amendment. It is anti-American and would set dangerous precedent forever. The law has developed over the years to clearly establish elected officials have the right to engage in protected speech. Mr. Trump is not just a guy on the street or a guy at a bar or a fire chief or a police officer. There were a few of them in there. All analogies given by the House managers. These sideways analogies are wrong. Mr. Trump was an elected official, and there is an entire body of law, Supreme Court landmark cases supporting the conclusion that Mr. Trump actually has enhanced free speech rights because he is an elected official. These cases are ignored by the House managers and the law professors. And that too is total intellectual dishonesty. The Supreme Court has long held that the First Amendment's right to freedom of speech protects elected officials. Two important on-point decisions from the Supreme Court, Wood versus Georgia and Bond versus Floyd, expressly contradict the House managers' position. The House managers do not even cite those cases in their brief. They barely acknowledged them in their reply, and they were mum on them yesterday. In Wood versus Georgia, the Supreme Court addressed a case involving a sitting sheriff whose re-election was being investigated by a grand jury impaneled by a judge based on allegations of irregular Negro bloc voting. It was in the 60s. The sheriff spoke publicly in multiple press releases calling the grand jury investigations racist, illegitimate, and an attempt to intimidate voters. He even urged the grand jurors on how to decide the issues and not let its high office be a party to any political attempt to intimidate voters. The sheriff viewed the grand jury as challenging the legitimacy of his election. The sheriff even sent a letter to the grand jurors with these allegations, which is an extraordinary step since laws in most states, including Georgia, prohibit attempts to influence or intimidate jurors. The sheriff was charged and convicted of contempt of court and obstruction of the grand jury. But the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Brennan, reversed. The court held that the First Amendment protected an elected public official's speech because the voting controversy directly affected the sheriff's political career. G29. The petitioner was an elected official and had, read with me, please, everybody. The petitioner was an elected official and had the right to enter the field of political controversy, particularly where his political life was at stake. The role that elected officials play in our society makes it all the more imperative that they be allowed freely to express themselves on matters of current public importance. Wood, thus, stands for the proposition that a difference of political opinion expressed in a speech on an issue of voting irregularity cannot be punishable where all that was done was to encourage investigation and peaceful political speech. Just like Mr. Trump has done here. The legal scholars call that directly on point. A second case, Bond versus Floyd, involved a state legislature punishing an elected official for protected political speech. Bond is particularly instructive here too. In Bond, the Supreme Court squarely addressed the question of an elected official's punishment by a legislature for statements alleged to have incited public violation of the law, the burning of draft cards. The court unequivocally rejected the idea, advanced here by the House managers, that an elected official is entitled to no protection under the First Amendment. The Supreme Court held that the Georgia House of Representatives was, in fact, forbidden by the First Amendment from punishing Bond by not seating him for advocating against the policy of the United States. There are three fundamental holdings in Bond. One, the manifest function of the First Amendment in a representative government requires that legislators be given the widest latitude to express their views on issues of policy. Two, just as erroneous statements must be protected to give freedom of expression the breathing space it needs to survive, so statements criticizing public policy and the implementation of it must be similarly protected. Third holding, legislators have an obligation to take positions on controversial political questions so that their constituents can be fully informed by them and be better able to assess their qualifications. Please read along with me. Their qualifications for office. Also, so they may be represented in governmental debates by the person they have elected to represent them. Mr. Trump enjoys this same First Amendment protection from Congress. The First Amendment's protections guarantee free speech addressing the electoral integrity issues essential to his career that Mr. Trump has consistently advocated. The House managers argue that the First Amendment, and I quote, does not shield public officials who occupy sensitive policy-making positions from adverse actions when their speech undermines important governmental interests. That is flat wrong. They are, in essence, attempting to treat Mr. Trump as their employee. This is not the law under Wood and Bond. Mr. Trump was elected by the people. He is an elected official. The Supreme Court says elected officials must have the right to freely engage in public speech. Indeed, the Supreme Court expressly rejected the House manager's argument in Wood versus Georgia, holding that the sheriff was not a civil servant, but an elected official who had core First Amendment rights which could not be restricted. That's Wood v. Georgia, page 395, footnote 21. The House managers do not mention Wood or Bond in the trial brief or anywhere else. Why? Why not? Because it does not fit their narrative or their story. They want to punish Mr. Trump for engaging in constitutionally protected free speech, and they do not want you to consider the issue. But you must. Question 2. Does Mr. Trump's speech deserve protection under the First Amendment? There is no doubt Mr. Trump engaged in constitutionally protected political speech that the House has improperly characterized as incitement of insurrection. The fatal flaw of the House's argument is that it seeks to mete out governmental punishment, impeachment, based on First Amendment political speech. Speech for political purposes is the kind of activity to which the First Amendment offers its strongest protection. These are bedrock principles recognized by our Supreme Court for decades. The court has stated in no uncertain terms the importance of these principles to our democratic principles. The general proposition that freedom of expression upon public questions is secured by the First Amendment has long been settled by our decisions. The constitutional safeguard, we have said, was fashioned to assure unfettered interchange of ideas for the bringing about of political and social changes desired by the people. New York Times v. Sullivan. Our First Amendment decisions have created a rough hierarchy in the constitutional protection of speech. Core political speeches occupy the highest, most protected position. Even political speech that may incite unlawful conduct is protected from the reach of government punishment. The court has said every idea is an incitement, and if speech may be suppressed when it might inspire someone to act unlawfully, then there is no limit to the state's censorial power. The government may not prohibit speech because it increases the chances of an unlawful act will be committed at some indefinite time in the future. The House managers showed you a series of tweets going all the way back to 2015 in an effort to prove incitement. All of that evidence is totally irrelevant under the constitutional definition of incitement. Brandenburg versus Ohio is really the landmark case on the issue of incitement speech. Half of the case was mentioned yesterday. In the Brandenburg v. Ohio case, another landmark, the court held the government may only suppress speech for advocating the use of force or a violation of law if such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. The Brandenburg holding has been interpreted as having three basic prongs to determine if speech meet the definition of incitement. The Brandenburg test precludes speech from being sanctioned as incitement to a riot unless the speech explicitly or implicitly encouraged use of violence or lawless action. 2, the speaker intends that his speech will result in use of violence or lawless action. And 3, the imminent use of violence or lawless action is the likely result of the speech. The House managers cannot get past the first prong of the Brandenburg test. They have not and cannot prove Mr. Trump explicitly or implicitly encouraged use of violence or lawless action, period. Brandenburg requires a close examination of the words themselves. The words are either important or they're not. The House managers admitted that the incitement issue is not about the words. Why not? Because on the face of it, Mr. Trump's words are no different than the figurative speech used by every one of the senators assembled here today. If it is not about the words, but about the big lie of a stolen election, then why isn't House Manager Raskin guilty since he tried to overturn the 2016 election? The more the House managers speak, the more hypocrisy gets revealed. Hypocrisy. Even though they say it's not about the words, the law under Brandenburg requires a close analysis of the words to determine incitement. So we need to look at those words. Mr. Trump did the opposite of advocating for lawless action. The opposite. He expressly advocated for peaceful action at the Save America rally. He explicitly stated, these are the words, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. To peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. That is how this president has spoken for years when he condemns violence, lawlessness, and rioters. The House managers have played manipulated, selectively edited parts of Mr. Trump's speech. They focus heavily on the word fight. The president used the word fight 20 times in his speech. They picked only 2. Why? Why not the other 18? Because they don't tell the story the way they want to tell it. Here are all of them. Listen to the context.
And Rudy, you did a great job. He's got guts. You know what? He's got guts, unlike a lot of people in the Republican Party. He's got guts. He fights. He fights. And I'll tell you, thank you very much, John. Fantastic job. I watched. That's a tough act to follow, those two. There's so many weak Republicans, and we have great ones. Jim Jordan and some of these guys, they're out there fighting. The House guys are fighting. But it's incredible. Many of the Republicans, I helped them get in. I helped them get elected. Get rid of, how do you say, I want to get rid of America first? Even if you're going to do it, don't talk about it, right? Unbelievable what we have to go through. What we have to go through, and you have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them. We're gonna let you know who they are. I could already tell you, frankly. Republicans are constantly fighting like a boxer with his hands tied behind his back. It's like a boxer. And we want to be so nice. We want to be so respectful of everybody, including bad people. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. Because you're sworn to uphold our Constitution. And the accountability says, if we see somebody in there that doesn't treat our vets well, or they steal, they rob, they do things badly, we say, Joe, you're fired. Get out of here. Before you couldn't do that. You couldn't do that before. So we've taken care of things. We've done things like nobody's ever thought possible. And that's part of the reason that many people don't like us, because we've done too much. But we've done it quickly, and we were going to sit home and watch a big victory, and everybody had us down for a victory. It was going to be great. And now we're out here fighting. I said to somebody I was going to take a few days and relax after our big electoral victory. 10 o'clock, it was over. The American people do not believe the corrupt fake news anymore. They have ruined their reputation. But you know, it used to be that they'd argue with me. I'd fight. So I'd fight, they'd fight, I'd fight, they'd fight. Boop, boop. You'd believe me, you'd believe them. Somebody comes out, you know. They had their point of view, I had my point of view. But you'd have an argument. Now what they do is they go silent. It's called suppression. And that's what happens in a communist country. That's what they do. They suppress. You don't fight with them anymore unless it's a bad story. If they have a little bad story about me, they make it 10 times worse and it's a major headline. But Hunter Biden, they don't talk about him. What happened to Hunter? Where's Hunter? With your help over the last 4 years, we built the greatest political movement in the history of our country, and nobody even challenges that. I say that over and over, and I never get challenged by the fake news, and they challenge almost everything we say. But our fight against the big donors, big media, big tech, and others is just getting started. This is the greatest in history. There's never been a movement like that. Our brightest days are before us. Our greatest achievements still wait. I think one of our great achievements will be election security, because nobody until I came along had any idea how corrupt our elections were. And again, most people would stand there at 9 o'clock in the evening and say, I want to thank you very much. And they go off to some other life. But I said, something's wrong here. Something's really wrong. Can't have happened. And we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country. And I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come.
A boxer fighting with his hand tied behind his back, members of Congress fighting, Rudy being Rudy. These are the metaphorical, rhetorical uses of the word fight. We all know that, right? Suddenly, the word fight is off limits. Spare us the hypocrisy and false indignation. It's a term used over and over and over again by politicians on both sides of the aisle. And of course, the Democrat House managers know that the word fight has been used figuratively in political speech forever. But don't take it from me. It's best to listen to them.
Our mission is to fight.
Our job is to fight.
We are in a fight. We are in a fight. We are in a fight.
Democrats are fighting as hard as we can.
Democrats are standing up to fight.
We know how to fight. We like a good fight.
Democrats are going to fight like hell.
We fight like hell.
I'm going to fight like hell.
I will fight like hell.
We're going to fight like hell.
I'm going to fight like hell.
Fight like hell.
I will fight like hell.
We have to fight like hell.
I, and I know many other senators and members of the House, will fight like hell.
We are going to fight like hell.
We're going to fight like hell.
Fight like hell.
And we just have to fight.
We're gonna fight. We are gonna fight. We're gonna fight. We're gonna fight.
Because you'll fight.
To fight.
Political revolution. That means that millions have got to stand up and fight.
And fight and fight. Stand up and fight back.
To fight and continue to fight. And once again, fight back in the fight.
We're fighting back.
My fight. To fight an administration.
You don't get what you don't fight for.
We'll also fight him and challenge him in every way that we can.
Fight in Congress, fight in the courts, fight in the streets.
In the Congress, in the courts, and in the streets.
There's the fight, there's the fight, there's the fight, and then there's the fight to defend.
We're eager to take on this fight.
The American people are going to have to fight.
Get in this fight. Get in this fight.
Around the clock fighting. We've got to keep fighting and keep focused.
We will fight when we must fight.
We've been fighting, so we need to fight, but we also need to fight.
It's always going to be an uphill fight.
This is going to be a fight.
We always must fight.
We're in the fight of our lives.
And we're going to be in for the fight of our lives.
This is the fight of our life.
The fight of their lives.
We are in this fight for our lives.
We cannot ever give up fighting.
Hypocrisy. The reality is Mr. Trump was not in any way, shape, or form instructing these people to fight or to use physical violence. What he was instructing them to do was to challenge their opponents in primary elections, to push for sweeping election reforms, to hold big tech responsible, all customary and legal ways to petition your government for redress of grievances, which of course is also protected constitutional speech. But the House managers don't want you to focus on those things because, again, it does not fit their story. In the end, I leave you with this quote from Benjamin Franklin. Freedom of speech is a principal pillar of a free government. When this support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected on its ruins. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate recess for a 15-minute break.
The object.
All right, just about 2 hours into the defense case, the president's lawyers making the case. They are taking their first break. Keep in mind that we expect that the Trump defense will only take a few hours, so this may be the only break before they go back into it. I want to bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and Chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Chuck, this seems to have tracked along pretty much the way that we expected to call the president's speech more political rhetoric than anything that would incite a crowd. Going after many of the usual enemies, the media and Democrats, and using the words of Democrats against this case, essentially indicting them for their words. Your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, Sean Hannity or Rush Limbaugh could have put this together. It was just sort of a lazy version of whataboutism. I mean, it really wasn't even that sophisticated. It was a bit intellectually dishonest in numerous times. But it's clear what they're trying to do, right? They're trying to isolate the January 6th speech. They're trying to ignore everything else about it. They're trying to ignore all the tweets around it. And look, there's still 2 hours. Maybe they will address the dereliction of duty issues with him during the siege and right after it. But this is a time, look, it can come across extraordinarily silly. I mean, to see them even replaying videos over and over, it almost feels as if like there's a term paper and they're trying to fill in the blanks here and adding the words very, 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 but instead they're using the word fight and, hey, let's extend the video play more to suck up time. But it's clearly designed to just, to the deepest of the sort of the talk radio, primetime cable base of the Republican Party, that part of it. And look, that's the animated part of this base, right? That is the Trump base. They're not trying to address any of the real elephants in the room right now, and maybe that's their fast track in their minds, their fast track to acquittal, but they're not actually addressing any of the real accusations that have been made against the former president.
Andrea, some of those accusations had to do with what the former president was saying at the time. His vice president was being whisked away to a secure location of the Capitol. What other things stood out in terms of things that have not been addressed so far that were made by the House managers?
Well, they certainly never addressed what he did during those 6 hours, and after being told by Senator Tuberville of Alabama that the vice president was being taken out and not responding at all with any concerns about his vice president or any effort to get the National Guard or anyone else in. But also the fact-checking, there was no Antifa leader who was arrested there. There was someone arrested but not connected to Antifa. To try to describe that rally as a left-wing inspired rally is absurd on its face. There was also the claim that that the House managers did not disclose the security footage beforehand to the defense. Well, this is not a trial in the classic sense of a trial. As the senators are not jurors, there is no obligation to disclose to the defense what their strategy is. I don't know if the defense had asked for that security footage. There's no indication that they had. They didn't claim that they had. They misstated what happened in Lafayette Square. There was no fencing around Lafayette Square at the time. There was no breach of any security wall. They also misstated Hillary Clinton. She conceded the morning after the election. I was there. She conceded that in the overnight hours as well at 2 or 3 in the morning, but she had a news conference. She, surrounded by her family and her top aides, were at a hotel in New York saying that President Trump had won and that she wished him well as a citizen. So it's not that she was denying the reality of the election results as Donald Trump did. She certainly raised questions about whether or not there had been election interference by the Russians, but that was certainly subsequent to years after, actually, to having conceded. Lester?
All right, Andrea, let me go to Casey Hunt, who's on Capitol Hill. Casey, many of the members who were in that room were unwitting stars of some of the videos that were played today as the president's lawyers really honed in on this idea of hypocrisy. What was the reaction among Democratic senators or even Republican senators as those videos were played?
Lester, I was actually in the chamber watching the senators as this video played on the screen, and while for the most part senators who saw themselves on the screen had studied non-reactions, it prompted whispers from their colleagues, comments throughout. And when the attorney turned at the end of that montage and seemed to direct his comments at the Democratic senators, there was a lot of shifting in seats, some outright laughter, and clearly a sense of what is the point here? Why did we just go through that exercise? Now, on the Republican side, everyone seemed to be watching along. Senator Josh Hawley, who, as we've noted earlier in the week, had been doing other things during the proceedings, seemed to be watching this time and perhaps taking notes on a pad of paper. At one point in the fight montage, Senator Rand Paul openly laughing as the Elizabeth Warren clips continued to play. It felt clear to me in the room that this was really a play to former President Trump's sensibilities, to the sensibilities of his supporters, to those who watch media outlets where many of these themes come, because this was not something really that in the room I don't think was taken in the same kind of serious way that it may be by people who are consuming that sort of media. Now, another note I should make, Lester, we've got some new reporting from the House managers who you may have seen at the top of the performance today. The Trump attorney took some issue with how some of the things were presented in the House managers' presentation. So they're defending themselves at this point. They acknowledge that there was a mistake with a tweet that showed a blue check mark, but they also point out that they've had to recreate a lot of this because former President Trump was kicked off Twitter after the riot. And so they have to use archives to reconstruct all of these graphics, which they say that President Trump's attorneys should be willing to or should rather know as they're working on this presentation.
Casey, let me ask you, will the House managers have a chance to rebut some of the things said today, to walk us through the end game and all this?
Well, Lester, there still are going to be closing arguments, so we will have another opportunity to hear from House managers, and then, of course, again, from former President Trump's defense attorneys. The way that it's structured, the managers could save out some of their time and have basically the last word on the floor. But before we get to that point, we're going to have a question and answer session from senators. And while the prosecution and the defense seem to have not taken the entirety of their time, I'm interested to see, the senators have 4 hours for Q&A. In the last impeachment trial, they took all of their time. They don't typically like to give up their own time, but then again, there is a very real sense people want to get on with this. So I think you could potentially see them asking questions that allow the House managers to come back and make these cases in public, potentially to respond to what the Trump team has done here. But we're just going to have to wait and see. We do know that right now, senators are crafting questions, submitting questions behind the scenes. They're going to be looked at to make sure that they're not repetitive and organized ahead of time before we get to that phase of the trial, which could come later today or tomorrow, Lester.
All right, Casey. Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, ultimately, this is about some Republican senators needing the sufficient cover to vote for acquittal. That's the bar here. How does it look?
Well, the reaction that Casey just described from some of the senators in the room, I think, is interesting. And the reaction that I imagine that we're seeing, although we don't have a camera at Mar-a-Lago right now, from Donald Trump, I think is worth noting. I think there are things that he would have liked in that presentation. Number one, the audiovisual element of it. He's a person who likes TV. There were plenty of clips, in some instances, repetitive clips as you were watching through them, including some of the montages that we saw there. The Trump defense team and those around the Trump defense team liked that. They thought and said publicly, as this presentation was happening over the last 2 hours, that was basically hammering or pummeling the point home that they wanted to make. I think that if you're Donald Trump, you also like to see his attorneys, two of them at least, use some of these buzzwords that we often hear in conservative circles. So, for example, you heard one of the former president's attorneys call this constitutional cancel culture, basically seizing on this sort of line that's been used in various other instances, not at all relating to impeachment, in conservative circles in the last year or so, 6 months or so. You also heard one of the attorneys say this is not whataboutism, to the point that Chuck Todd made just a couple of minutes ago, it is, in fact, the definition of whataboutism, and that it is essentially looking to equivocate the actions and the language of former President Trump to things that Democrats have said in an entirely different context and one that was not shown there. So here's what's not been addressed. And you talked about the questions of what is still sort of out there. We do have time left, right? They technically have up to, I think, 14 more hours. They are certainly not expected to take all this time. But one of the things that really hasn't been touched on yet that Republicans do want to know about or will want to hear about, including certainly Democrats too, is what about the case that the House managers made specifically yesterday, linking the acts of the insurrectionists, the language of the insurrectionists, to direction from Donald Trump himself? That's going to be important for the defense team to try to put up some kind of answer to here, because that is an open question. When you look ahead to the Q&A, there are other senators, I think Republican Bill Cassidy among them, who want to know more about that phone call between Tommy Tuberville, Senator Tuberville, then President Trump, now former President Trump, the timing of what he knew and when he knew it. There are things that Republicans sitting in that room will want to hear. Broadly, however, at this point, the defense team is making much more of a political argument than a legal argument. It took probably 90 minutes or so to get to some of the meat and potatoes of the legal case. But then again, Lester, as we've been saying, that's not necessarily what this is about. This is not a court of law. That has been made very clear. This is a political proceeding, and the Trump defense team is seizing on that, Lester.
Yeah, and yet there are legal arguments. Let's go to former U.S. Attorney and senior FBI official and an NBC News contributor, Chuck Rosenberg, and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb is a former U.S. attorney. Really, there seem to be two legal arguments that were put there, so I'm going to let you guys split it up. Chuck, first, take on the First Amendment argument that the president's attorneys are making. Is it a solid one? Where do you see holes in it, if there are?
Oh, I don't think it's a solid one at all. And I think there's a significant hole in it, Lester. Let me give you an example. Imagine that on Martin Luther King Day, former President Trump decided to put on a Ku Klux Klan robe and a Nazi swastika armband and march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Is that protected by the First Amendment? Absolutely. Absolutely clear. No question about it. Would that be impeachable? Of course it would be impeachable for a whole bunch of reasons, including that the Senate has the sole power to try all cases of impeachment, and the House has the sole power to impeach for high crimes and misdemeanors, which we know includes public misconduct. And so the First Amendment argument, reference to the 1969 Supreme Court case of Brandenburg, a very important case in First Amendment jurisprudence, is interesting. It's also completely beside the point.
All right, let me turn to Carol on the other legal argument I heard, and there may have been more in there, but the idea that the former president has been denied due process. Carol, dissect that argument for me.
Well, that argument has even less merit than the First Amendment argument. That argument, and I'm sure Chuck would agree with this, as all former prosecutors would, there is no due process right during an investigative stage. The Republicans brought this up last year, in last year's impeachment hearing as well, when they argued, unfortunately, incorrectly, that they were denied due process and the ability to attend the hearings that led up to the impeachment. But when a prosecutor is investigating a case and determining whether to bring charges, as is the House's role in an impeachment, there is simply no due process allowance. And as Jamie Raskin noted yesterday, sometimes that opportunity is presented to the person who might be impeached, but it does not have to be. There was time pressure here, and there was also, probably more importantly, just a lot of public evidence in this case. There was no secret about what was being investigated or what the evidence was, frankly. Well, so that was simply not a meritorious argument.
Yeah, I mean, the president's lawyers will argue, and they did argue, that those surveillance tapes, which were revealed for the first time, weren't presented to the defense ahead of time as you would in a trial with discovery. Does that in itself undermine due process?
You know, the rules are what the rules are, what the Senate decides the rules are. in a criminal court of law or even a civil court of law, there are many, many rules and a lot of case law that is imposed by courts in the wake of laws being passed, and people have to abide by those rules. In this case, there are simply no rules governing discovery. If the defense wanted to show videos as they did that others had not seen before, there's no rule governing that. And when we talk about precedent in an impeachment, that things have been done previously in impeachment hearings, and that's precedent. It may well be precedent, but it is not binding precedent. That's the point. The rules in this impeachment are what the rules that this Senate today says are the rules.
Chuck, anything else stand out to you in this first part of the defense's case? Not sure we have Chuck with us anyway. We should note on the others. Oh, there you are. Go ahead, Chuck.
Yeah, no, I would add another point to what Carol said, and I agree with her. It was interesting to hear the defense team argue that they were denied due process. Remember, this is the same defense team that met with jurors, senators, to map out trial strategy. Now, that's a remarkable thing. Carol and I were federal prosecutors. You don't even look at jurors when you are not in the courtroom. You don't talk to them. If you pass them in the hallway, you go to the other side of the hall. If an elevator door opens and there's a juror in it, you don't get on the elevator. And yet these defense lawyers who were complaining about violations of due process are mapping out trial strategy with jurors. Extraordinary.
All right. And, on the right side of your screen, we should know these are just pictures of the corridors outside the Senate chambers and just some of the comings and goings of the senators and their staff during this brief break. I want to go to Chief White House correspondent Kristen Welker right now while we have a moment. Kristen, the president has made it clear right now his focus is on COVID and other pressing matters. To the extent he's actually watching this physically, I guess is an open question, but how closely are they following all this?
Well, they are following it, Lester, and heading into this week, President Biden, his top advisors have said that he was going to keep the focus on the fight against COVID-19, really only weighing in on that matter. But as we have gotten more deeply into this trial, the president is increasingly weighing in on the matter. It happened again early this morning. He and the First Lady came out to tour this Valentine's display that is set up here on the North Lawn behind me. And when he was asked about the impeachment trial, the president said he's anxious to see what his Republican friends will do. Will they, quote, stand up? And of course, that comes on the heels yesterday, Lester, of my asking him in the Oval Office about the newly revealed videos that we all saw this week of that attack against the Capitol. And President Biden responded to that by saying that he thinks it could sway some minds. And now, just moments ago, in the press briefing room, Jen Psaki, who's the White House press secretary, weighed in again on the matter. She said that it's all a reminder of why this can't happen again, and that the president wants his Republican colleagues to take their responsibility very seriously. So that is the tone that is coming from this administration, again, as the president increasingly weighs on what we're seeing on Capitol Hill. Now, he's also trying to keep the focus on his agenda, on his push to get that $1.9 trillion COVID relief package passed. He had a bipartisan meeting with governors and mayors earlier today, and that was the key focus. Lester, he wants it to pass with bipartisan support, and it increasingly looks like that might not happen, that Democrats may have to go it alone. But nonetheless, this is the backdrop, this impeachment trial, and there are concerns among top White House officials that what's happening on Capitol Hill, if it doesn't get wrapped up quickly, could slow the momentum for the president's legislative agenda. Now, publicly, they are not weighing in on the timeline, but those are the conversations that are happening privately. In terms of this continuing through the weekend, we know that the president is going to be at Camp David, his first trip that he will make as president. He has said he's not watching these proceedings as they unfold live because he's been so busy working on COVID-19. That's the message from the president, but clearly paying very close attention to what's happening on Capitol Hill and watching the news reports, Lester.
All right, David Cho there, one of the president's lawyers making his way back toward the chambers. Kristen, thank you. Joining me now is Jonathan Capehart, host of the Sunday Show on MSNBC and also NBC News political analyst and editor of the National Review, Rich Lowry. Gentlemen, good to have you both here. Let me start with you, Jonathan. Just ticking off some of the key words in the first few minutes of the defense presentation: Antifa, cancel culture, witch hunt, Elizabeth Warren. These are obviously names that spark a lot of emotion among the president's base. How key was it that they quickly went there?
I think it's key, Lester, because you're focused on this is language that appeals to the president's base. But more importantly, it is language that has come out of the former president's own mouth. And so the entire presentation of the defense, I kept thinking the things that I always thought during Donald Trump's presidency, whenever any of his officials were speaking ostensibly to the public, you always got the sense, and eventually you always knew that those officials were speaking to an audience of one. They were speaking directly to the president, then President Trump, because they knew he was watching, they knew he was listening, and they knew that they would be berated if they did not hew to the lines and the arguments that he wanted out there. And so when cancel culture was said, when witch hunt was said, barely 2 minutes into their presentation, the light bulb went off in my head and said, they're not really talking to the senators. They're not even talking to the American people in the way that the House impeachment managers. They are talking to Donald Trump. And we know that Donald Trump is watching because of the press reports about how angry he was on the first day of the trial when the arguments were going back and forth over the constitutionality of the actual trial, and how angry he was with his lawyer, Mr. Castor, which is why we have not seen him today. So it's an audience of one, has always been, and apparently will continue to be.
Yeah, Rich, weigh in on that for me. Let's say it's an audience for one, but if you're a Republican member of the Senate who's been feeling really queasy about all this, does anything you've seen in the first part of this day would make you feel better about acquitting?
Yes. Now, obviously, they're throwing out a lot of flack, and they are concerned with President Trump and what he thinks of everything they're saying. But I think that the key thing to focus on is what I believe is the defect in the article of impeachment, which strongly implies, if it doesn't explicitly state, that the president had the intent for these protesters to ransack the Capitol. That's at the heart of the article. And I don't believe that's true, and I certainly don't believe it was proven. And I think at the end of the president's defense right before this break, that was the point of the emphasis on the word fight. Because the Democrats say, look, he said fight. You know, he said fight like hell. He wanted them to go beat up police officers and try to run down and hang Mike Pence. And the president's lawyers are saying, no, everyone uses that word. It's kind of martial imagery that's common in our political discourse. So you can't hang intent on that. So I believe that this is the defect in the article. I think if Democrats in the House had taken more time with it, thought about it, marinated in the factual record more, they would have written it differently. There are all sorts of blameworthy things that you could put in the article without stretching to something that can't be proven, and I think is factually incorrect.
All right, let me bring Chuck Todd in here and Andrew Mitchell as well. Chuck, I don't know how many times we heard the word fight, but did they effectively take the sting out of the word? We heard it over the last couple of days from the House managers, from the president's mouth, trying to create that linkage. He's telling them to go fight at the Capitol. Hearing it and presented in this way with the dramatic music behind it and the beating drums, did that take some of the sting out of the word?
Well, what they want to do, I think, in fact, I think it's even more narrow than that, Lester, what the motive is. It's to make the focus the speech itself. They want the January 6th speech itself in isolation. They want that to say, well, that wasn't, you can't point to just that. Now, of course, that's not the Democratic House manager's case. They have a case where they're saying, hey, this was a 5-year campaign and certainly a 30-day effort to sort of plan and make this happen. But I do think the whole point of the fight montage was to try to say, hey, don't pay attention to the other arguments, just pay attention to that speech. So I do think it both exposes their own defense flaws. It's hard to defend against much of what the House impeachment managers have laid out. So they're trying to find the narrowest path that they think they can find something that's, you know, a fig leaf to defend themselves with. So diluting the word fight is about the best they could come up with.
And Andrew, we just watched Senator Mitch McConnell walk by the camera there. This trial is moving at a very quick pace. If we understand right, the defense is going to wrap up here within the next hour or two. At what point are Republicans going to need to hear from Mitch McConnell about where he's going?
Some of them may already have heard from him, although he's been very oblique, to say the least. But there was a gathering of some of the more moderate, though conservative Republicans around Mitch McConnell that Casey and others noted during recesses yesterday. And so he may be signaling to some of his allies. Senator Thune, who sits near him, of course, is the number 2 in their caucus. So they may already understand where he's going. And there's no one really who thinks that 17 Republicans will vote to convict, but there may be more than the 5 or 6 that we are now suggesting, if Mitch McConnell does and some of these other Republicans who do have questions. I think the questions, actually, that are asked by the senators will give us a pretty good clue as to what they want to ask from each side. I just want to point out also something interesting, that the same Supreme Court case was cited by both sides, Jamie Raskin and by the defense, on opposite sides of the argument about the First Amendment free speech privilege. And it does involve, interestingly, a man named Clarence Brandenburg, who in 1964, after the landmark Civil Rights Act was passed by Lyndon Johnson and, of course, signed by Lyndon Johnson, he was a Ku Klux Klan member leading a rally in Ohio. And he was jailed for incitement of a riot and wearing KKK robes and the like. He was defended in a Supreme Court argument by none other than Eleanor Holmes Norton, the black woman who is the 83-year-old longtime veteran delegate from the District of Columbia to Congress. And she was asked recently by the Washington Post about this, and the Supreme Court upheld the case, saying that he was not inciting to riot. And she said that as an ACLU lawyer then and now as a free speech proponent, she believes that that was the right case because he was not inciting a riot. But the counter-argument made by Jamie Raskin is that President Trump was, and that was from his statements before, during, and after. So that selective editing of the January 6th speech by the defense is very much in dispute.
All right, Andrea, thanks. Again, we've been watching members of the Senate and staff making their way down these corridors, and there's likely some interesting conversations taking place, and Casey Hunt has been observing some of them. Casey.
Lester, that's right. And we just saw Senator Ted Cruz go into the LBJ room off the Senate floor where the defense has been working throughout this trial. We saw him yesterday meeting with Donald Trump's defense team here at the Capitol, along with a couple of other Republican senators. And I think that gives you a window into how they're proceeding here, because the reality is, I think there was a sense it would be hard for the defense team to do worse than they did in their opening arguments. They were widely panned, criticized by Republicans as being unfocused. Of course, we've reported, our White House team has reported that former President Trump was not pleased with their presentation. So clearly there were some who felt a need to make sure that they were involved here. And what you've seen, I think, is an attempt to push everyone back into their partisan corners. There are reminders to people watching, whether they be in particular Trump supporters, that these are your enemies, the media, the Democrats, the way that they are being hypocritical toward you, you are the victim of their manipulation. Those are themes that really hit on many of the culture war items that many of Republicans, certainly like Ted Cruz, often push on when they appear on places like Fox News or Newsmax. So I think you're seeing that play out in real time. And the question for me is, okay, we've seen all of this play out, but the reality is the actions that were taken in the wake of what President Trump said, they have not been the focus of the defense today. And the reality is we're still living here at the Capitol with all of the impacts of that. I mean, there are National Guard troops in the tunnels underneath these buildings, hundreds of them with guns that are very, frankly, jarring to see. There's razor wire around the entire complex. The roads are still closed. It's hard to drive down those broad avenues here in Washington, D.C., along the mall that's supposed to be, America's really demonstration of democracy, that the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Monument, and of course, down at this end, the Capitol of the United States. And that's all because of the actions that were taken in the wake of what President Trump did. And I also think it shows you why the House managers set up their arguments the way they did. They started well before January 6th to show how what the president did in the lead up to that speech that he made were also relevant to this argument about incitement. So again, the question is, are there any Republicans that are going to be convinced here? Is there some cover that the defense team can give to Republicans who don't want to vote to acquit the president, but who are feeling conflicted or troubled about it? And, that I think is the one answer that's still outstanding. We've had a little bit of praise for the Republican presentation today from people like Lisa Murkowski, but the reality is we also believe that we know where Murkowski is going to come down on this and that she is likely to vote to convict this president. So there's still that big question hanging out there of what Mitch McConnell is going to do. And I think the reporting that I'm pursuing over the course of the next few hours is, okay, how did he react to what he saw today? How did John Thune, his number 2, react to what he saw today? Because I think that may tell us a lot about the next 24 hours.
Yeah, all right, Casey, thank you. Let me bring in attorney Dan Goldman, who assisted the Democrats during the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Dan, I want to talk about, there's going to be obviously more of the defense case, but then there's going to be this question and answer period. If you're a Democratic senator right now, what questions have been unanswered that you would want to ask to this defense team?
Oh, there are a lot of questions that I'd want to ask. The first would be, if Donald Trump is not responsible for the insurrection, why were there so many Republican officials going on television during the riot saying that Donald Trump needs to call it off because he's the only one who can? Why were so many of the supporters saying on Parler or other social media postings that they were there at the direction of Donald Trump? We really haven't addressed what Rich Lowry's point is very much at all. We haven't addressed a number of things. They haven't addressed the constitutional argument. They haven't addressed this intent argument. I thought the first thing that they would do would be to condemn the attacks and try to distance Donald Trump from them. They haven't done that yet. And they haven't addressed any of what you just recited, the sort of buildup to the January 6th event, which is everything in terms of proving intent. It's showing there was a pattern in practice of Trump making inflammatory comments and his supporters reacting with violence that Trump would then endorse. That indicated that he certainly intended to incite them to protest. So, I mean, there are a ton of questions that are unanswered now, and I'm guessing will remain unanswered after this presentation, because they are just trying to find a couple of talking points that can be replayed on conservative media that the Senate Republicans can glom onto, that they can then hang their acquittal verdict on without taking, too much heat. And I frankly expect to see a little bit more of some of what I said just now, but I thought that some of the claims about manipulating evidence and the partisan talk about unity and divisiveness, it's really hard to hear that sort of thing when Donald Trump has still not recognized Joe Biden as legitimate president. He has still not admitted that his big lie was a lie. It's hard to then claim, oh, this is a divisive proceeding. So I would anticipate that they will get to more of the meat and potatoes of what their argument is going to be.
Yeah, well, we'll see here very shortly when this trial resumes. Dan, thank you. Hallie Jackson, let's talk about the defense team and what their plan is for the rest of the afternoon.
Well, if they've got more meat and potatoes to get to, as Dan Goldman just laid out, it's going to be on a pretty small plate, because Trump attorney David Schoen is telling one of our NBC News colleagues over on Capitol Hill that they don't have much left, which means this is going to wrap up probably within the next hour to perhaps 2 hours, probably max, which means we may be barreling toward that Senate Q&A at some point tonight in what is really, Lester, an extraordinarily accelerated timeline, especially considering what has been laid out now from the House Democratic managers. Listen, nobody wants this to be dragged out, at least on the defense side. That has been a very specific point that has been made repeatedly by those on the former president's defense team. But if this goes at the rate we think it'll go, it might be closer to 3 hours even than 4. And this had been the plan, at least as of yesterday. That said, at least as of late last night, our team has reported that the Trump legal team was still trying to put together how their arguments would come together, who would go when, the order, et cetera. You're seeing some of that now. You will see, as we heard at the very top of the defense team presentation, Bruce Castor, who is that attorney that so irritated former President Trump, based on the sources that I've talked to and our team has talked to, when he spoke earlier in the week. So that is something to keep an eye on. But again, it does look like we may be headed to that Q&A. Of course, it's up to the Senate to decide what happens when. Do they want to pause, come back tomorrow for that? But given sort of the desire, at least on the part of many Senate Republicans, to get through this, it seems like that's where we're going here, Lester.
Yeah, and we should note, of course, the House managers did not use their allotted time, coming up, I think, 5 or 6 hours shorter than what they were allocated. Let's go to Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker right now. Kristen, what sort of reaction are you getting to what we have seen thus far?
Well, former President Trump's allies believe this has been a very strong presentation so far by the legal team. They think that this was an important reset from everything that Hallie was just talking about, that first appearance by the legal team, which disappointed the former president. And so now they watch and wait to see what happens in these final remaining hours. I do think, Lester, it's worth taking a step back and noting that all of this is unfolding against the backdrop of a Republican Party that is sharply splintered right now. We know that just 6 Republican senators voted to say that, yes, these proceedings were even constitutional. So that, of course, gives us a potential indication of what we might see in a final vote. But behind the scenes, there's a lot more discord. We know that there are a number of Republicans who, for example, might vote to acquit former President Trump, but who still feel let down by his behavior on January 6th. And today, these stunning quotes that we are getting from former President Trump's UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who said in an interview, Lester, and let me just read you some of what she said. She was asked about the former president's words and actions on that day. She said, "We need to acknowledge he let us down. He went down a path he shouldn't have, and we shouldn't have followed him. We shouldn't have listened to him, and we can't let that ever happen again." When she was asked if she thought Mr. Trump could run for office again, she says she doesn't. She thinks he's fallen too far. Now, we have reached out to people in Mr. Trump's inner circle to try to get reaction to that. So far, we haven't been able to. We've also, of course, reached out to Nikki Haley. It is worth noting she's someone who has her own eyes on a potential run in 2024. But it does underscore what is happening here within the Republican Party. You have people choosing sides about what happened on January 6th and about former President Trump. Now, if you look at the polls, he is still very popular within the Republican Party. He still has a very strong base of support. And so anyone who wants to run in 2024, Lester, is going to have to contend with that. And that's part of the political box that a number of these Republican senators find themselves in right now. But again, just remarkable comments coming from former President Trump's former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, who, of course, left long before the Trump presidency was over. Lester, in part, it was thought at the time to try to distance herself from a very controversial figure who is now increasingly more controversial.
All right, Kristen, thanks. I want to bring Chuck Todd back into the conversation if I can. Chuck, unless I miss it, they didn't really address in a big way what the Democrats have been labeling the big lie, the president's contention that the election had been stolen. It seems a little awkward that you've got, Republicans in those chambers who bought into this, who supported this. So do you expect that the defense is going to take that on or just move past it?
Lester, I think that they would claim they already took it on. I think that they're in their own whataboutism way. That was the point of putting Hillary Clinton up there. That was the point of talking about Jamie Raskin being one of those that rose to challenge the electors in January 6 on 2017. So I think that is their attempt to try to dilute that charge as well. But look, they're already having a real trouble here Their first 2 hours of presentation isn't holding up well under fact checks. Apparently, they claimed somehow they didn't get those videos beforehand. Well, it turns out they did. And I do want to remind folks one other thing. There's this conversation about due process. Did they get their due process? Well, the House impeachment managers have a very important Republican ally on their side on this question, and it's Mitch McConnell. When both McConnell and Schumer agreed to the rules of the trial, here's what McConnell said in a statement. Republicans set out to ensure the Senate's next steps will respect former President Trump's rights and due process, the institution of the Senate, and the office of the presidency. That goal has been achieved. This is a win for due process and fairness. Those are the words of Mitch McConnell about the rules of this trial. So it is almost foundational undermining of their due process argument, Lester.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to bring Rich Lowry back into this and talk a little more about Mitch McConnell and what influence he still wields here.
Yeah, obviously a key and interesting player. And I've never thought conviction was in the cards, Lester, except for that moment, couple days, when there was a leak from McConnell's team, very deliberate, very calculated, to the New York Times saying that he was glad that Trump was getting impeached by the House, and he didn't know where he was going to come down on conviction. And I think that was McConnell kind of testing the waters, seeing if something would break loose within his own caucus, and you'd get more than the 5 votes we're probably going to get for conviction, whether it be a higher number. And I think if it was a higher number, that McConnell probably would have joined it. I think his calculations probably have changed now, that he realizes as the leader that he can't be one of 6. You know, he could be one of 12, one of 17, but one of 6 would be awkward for him. And then I imagine, I'm guessing also has an eye to future political fights with the Trump forces and realizes voting to convict will make him very radioactive for a lot of voters.
All right, Rich, thank you. Senator Leahy is back, and we're going to trial resumes.
Mr. Castro is recognized.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, good afternoon. It has been my great privilege over the past couple of weeks to lead this outstanding team of lawyers and dedicated professionals in the defense of the 45th President of the United States. One of the most difficult things in leading such a talented group is deciding who's responsible for what and the strategy and the order in which we will present our evidence. And you have heard from Mr. Vanderveen and Mr. Sean on the importance of the First Amendment and the importance of due process of law. And because I had the opportunity to set out the schedule, I decided that I would take the last substantive part of the case for myself. You can take that 2 ways. The first, perhaps, is the best, and that would be that it's almost over. The second is that perhaps you have to wait another hour for it to be over. The reason why I chose this section, and believe me, it was a very difficult decision to make because I thought that the other arguments presented by Mr. Sean and Mr. Vanderveen were outstandingly researched, thoroughly vetted, and wonderfully and articulately presented by them. But the critical issue in this case is the very narrow issue that is charged against the 45th president. And that issue is, did the 45th president engage in incitement of, they continue to say, insurrection? Clearly, there was no insurrection. Insurrection is a term of art. It's defined in the law. It involves taking over a country, a shadow government, taking the TV stations over, and having some plan on what you're going to do when you finally take power. Clearly, this is not that. What our colleagues here across the aisle meant is incitement to violence, to riot. So the word incitement is the critical case and the critical issue in the case. Now, the first time that you heard from us, I told you that you would never hear from our side that what happened on January 6th was anything other than horrific, and that the 45th President of the United States and his lawyers and his entire team adamantly denounce that violence by those criminals that occurred in this very chamber, this very building. There was a reason why we started our presentation back on Tuesday in that way. Because I did not want the senators to consider that there was any challenge to that particular fact. And yet, the House managers, knowing it was not contested at all, chose to spend 14 plus hours showing you pictures of how horrific the attack on the United States Capitol was. They spent no time at all in connecting legally the attack on the Capitol to the 45th President of the United States, which is the only question that needs to be answered, was Donald Trump responsible for inciting the violence that came to this building on January 6th? Now, by any measure, President Trump is the most pro-police, anti-mob rule president this country has ever seen. His real supporters know this. He made it clear throughout his presidency. He made it clear during the violence this past summer. He made it clear on January 6th. But politics changes things. Politics has created and interposed an element that should not be here. It has interposed the element of hatred. And the political world changes when hatred becomes part of the dynamic. As we wrote in our answer to the original charging document, and I hope that this is a phrase that lives on long after we are all departed, and that I hope someday this becomes the mantra by which all of us operate who work for the benefit of the public. That political hatred has no place in the American justice system, and most certainly no place in the Congress of the United States. To illustrate the contrast that I'm speaking of, we have a video.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
The vast majority of the protests have been peaceful.
Republicans stand for law and order, and we stand for justice.
I just don't even know why there aren't uprisings all over the country, and maybe there will be.
My administration will always stand against violence, mayhem, and disorder.
There needs to be unrest in the streets for as long as there's unrest in our lives.
I stand with the heroes of law enforcement.
And you push back on them, and you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
We will never defund our police. Together, we will ensure that America is a nation of law and order.
We were in high school, I'd take you behind the gym and beat the hell out of him.
But I think you need to go back and punch him in the face.
Feel like punching him.
We just want law and order. Everybody wants that.
I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, You have released the whirlwind, and you will pay the price.
We want law and order. We have to have law and order.
Show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
We believe in safe streets, secure communities, and we believe in law and order.
Is there truly anyone in this chamber who disagrees with the words as spoken by President Trump on that video? Surely not. Surely not. This contrast, and in this context, I ask you to keep that in mind. My colleagues here, actually my colleague here, Mr. Raskin, hopes that you don't. They have used selective editing and manipulated visuals to paint a picture far different from this truth. Make no mistake, and I will repeat it now and anytime I'm ever asked, January 6th was a terrible day for our country. The attack on this building shocked us all. President Trump did not incite or cause the horrific violence that occurred on January 6th, 2021. They know that. We know the president did not incite the riot because of his plain words that day, as Mr. Van der Veen elucidated on a few moments ago. We know the president could not have incited the riots because of the timeline of the events of that day. We heard a great deal from the House manager about their prosecutorial bona fides and their ability to analyze evidence, apply it to statutes, use timelines, and figure out what happened based on circumstantial evidence and direct evidence and testimony and forensic analysis. I can't recall any of the House managers who got up that didn't make some reference to prosecutorial bona fides. Well, I spent more than 3 decades locking up killers. And I do know a little bit about applying the facts to the law. We know that the president would never have wanted such a riot to occur because his long-standing hatred for violent protesters and his love for law and order is on display, worn on his sleeve, every single day that he served in the White House. But if we're going to apply the facts to the statute, it has to be done systematically. It has to be done with precision, the way a court would expect us to do that. Let's look at the letter of the law. Again, Mr. Van der Veen gave you an overview of the Brandenburg case and some of the related cases. You notice that when Mr. Van der Veen listed the elements that he took verbatim or close to verbatim right out of Brandenburg, they bore no reference whatsoever to the elements that were flashed up by the Democrat managers the other day repeatedly. He actually used the Supreme Court's case. He didn't make it up. Let's look at the letter of the law. The Supreme Court of the United States over 50 years ago laid out a clear test to determine whether speech is incitement. Under that test, the Brandenburg versus Ohio test, there are 3 elements that must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt by a preponderance of the evidence, whatever the Senate considers, I suggest, beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the speech in question must explicitly or implicitly encourage the use of violence or lawless action. But here, the president's speech called for peaceful protest. Second, the speaker must intend that his speech will result in the use of violence or lawless action. And again, as Mr. Van der Veen pointed out, the president clearly deplores rioters and political violence and did so throughout his term as president and never hesitated to express his admiration for the men and women that protect this country. Finally, the third element under the Brandenburg test is the imminent use of violence imminent use of violence, in other words, right then, the imminent use of violence or lawless action must be the likely result of the speech. The likely result of the speech. Well, that argument is completely eviscerated by the fact that the violence was pre-planned, as confirmed by the FBI, Department of Justice, and even the House managers, not the result of the speech at all. Several of my colleagues at the House managers got up and spoke about the proceeding in the House being like a grand jury proceeding. Well, I've been in grand jury proceedings. I have run grand juries. In grand jury proceedings, you call witnesses. You hear evidence. You make transcripts. You take affidavits. You develop physical evidence. You hear reports from police officers. You hear forensic analysis from scientists. In fact, you invite the target of the grand jury to come in and testify if he or she pleases to be heard by the grand jury. Which one of those things happened in the House prior to the impeachment article? I don't believe any of them happened. So the suggestion that what happened in the House was anything at all like a grand jury investigating a case and preferring it for prosecution is complete nonsense. And if the House managers are trying to fool you about that, you must ask yourself, what else are they trying to fool you about? Let's look more closely at the president's speech. We have mentioned this line before, but it is so critical we need to talk about it again. The president asked that the attendees at his rally peacefully make their voices heard.
I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
The managers would have you believe that the president's supporters usually follow his every word, but in this case, imputed some imaginary meaning to them while ignoring his most clear instructions. President Trump said, peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard, and the House managers took from that, go down to the Capitol and riot. So you are supposed to put yourselves in the heads of the people who hear peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard and conclude that those words do not mean what the president said. More than that, the president criticized the destruction wrought by left-wing anarchists and rioters. He told his supporters that they build, they don't destroy.
If this happened to the Democrats, there'd be hell all over the country going on. There'd be hell all over the country. But just remember this, you're stronger, you're smarter, you've got more going than anybody, and they try and demean everybody having to do with us. And you're the real people. You're the people that built this nation. You're not the people that tore down our nation.
Is it possible, listening to those words in the proper cadence without them being edited or the sound changed so that they're indistinguishable or sounds as though the crowd is right there, but listening to it as you have here unedited by us, is it possible that President Trump's disdain for political violence could be any clearer to the persons listening as he was speaking? Is it possible that his words could have been misunderstood? I suggest to you that is impossible. Now, the House manager said the president told the crowd, quote, "You have to get out your people to fight." The House manager's claim is that the President of the United States was telling the audience to get each other to physically fight. But that is not what the President said. The people who should fight, he said, were members of Congress. If they don't fight, what the President said is, what should the rally attendees do? If members of Congress wouldn't fight for the principles they held dear, what was it that the President specifically told his supporters at that rally he wanted them to do? He wanted them to support primary challenges. Now, nobody in this chamber is anxious to have a primary challenge. That is one truism I think I can say with some certainty. But that's the way we operate in this country. When the people of a state want to change their representatives and their senators, they use the electoral process. President Trump told his listeners that if their members of Congress won't fight for their views, then go back home and find others that will. That's what President Trump said. The people who should fight were the members of Congress.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them, we're gonna let you know who they are. I could already tell you, frankly.
It is pretty stark contrast when you watch that video, isn't it? When you see the House manager tell you, and I don't know if we're under oath here, but when I walked into this room, I sure as heck felt I was under oath, and that I was speaking not only to senators of the United States, but before the entire world, and with God watching. And a House manager got up here and told you that the President of the United States on January the 6th, 2021, told the crowd that they had to go and fight. And the implication that they wanted you to draw was that he was sending them down to Capitol Hill to go and breach the building and trash the very sacred halls of Congress. But we now know that is not at all anything near what the President said. What the President said was, if you can't get your members of Congress to do as you would like them to do, you primary them. That's the American way. The first way that the House managers presented and wanted you to conclude, that's the criminal way. But what the President said was the American way. Again, House managers manipulated President Trump's words. I can't stand here and pretend to tell you that I know every time from all those videos that the House managers manipulated what the President said, put up evidence that was not with the foundation of correctness and admissibility we expect. I can't tell you that I picked up every one. I don't think Mr. Van der Veen or Mr. Schoen or any of the others that worked with us can tell you that. But what I can tell you is that there were an awful lot of times, and I know at least some of you were judges in previous lives, and if one of the lawyers was able to create the impression that one side intentionally presented false or misleading evidence, that judge would give an instruction called falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one thing, false in everything. In other words, if they're trying to fool you about one thing, not only might they be trying to fool you in something else, but under that maxim of the law, you may conclude they're trying to fool you in everything else. President Trump was immediate in his calls for calm and respect for law enforcement. The House managers emphasized President Trump's tweet in the 6 p.m. hour where he told crowds to, quote, "Go home in love and peace and remember this day." What is it that they left out? Well, the House starts their recitation of what President Trump said as far as the aftermath of when the Capitol was breached at roughly 6 p.m. What they don't tell you and didn't tell you, and which you probably don't know because I think I'm the first one to say it in this forum, is at 2:38, President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to, quote, "Stay peaceful. Please support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are truly on the side of our country. Stay peaceful." And before we run the graphic, I just want to point out to you, President Trump's speech ended at 1:11 p.m. So at 2:38 p.m., by the time word reaches the president that there's a problem down here, he's out urging people to support the police, stay peaceful, support our Capitol Police and law enforcement. They are on the side of the country. Stay peaceful. At 3:13 p.m., President Trump urged protesters at the U.S. Capitol to remain peaceful. No violence. Remember, we are the party of law and order. Respect the law and our great men and women in blue. 3:13 p.m. President Trump's words couldn't have incited the riot at the Capitol. The day's events make this clear. Let's walk through the actual timeline. At 11:15 a.m., police security camera videos show crowds forming at First Street near the Capitol reflecting pool. This is a full 45 minutes before President Trump even took the stage on January 6th. Let me repeat that. Violent criminals were assembling at the Capitol over a mile away, almost an hour before the president uttered a single word on the ellipse. You did not hear that fact during the hours and hours of the House manager's presentation, did you? When the president spoke, what did he call for? He called for rally attendees to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard, for them to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue to cheer on members of Congress. President Trump went on for more than an hour, ending at 1:11. Now, why is this important? Because of all of the events that I am about to describe, they all occurred before President Trump's remarks concluded. At 12:49 p.m., the first barriers at the U.S. Capitol grounds were pushed over and the crowd entered the restricted area. At 11:05 p.m., Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller received open source reports of demonstrator movements to the U.S. Capitol. At 1:09 p.m., U.S. Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sun called the House and Senate Sergeants at Arms, telling them he wanted an emergency declared and he wanted the National Guard called. The point? Given the timeline of events, the criminals at the Capitol weren't there at the ellipse to even hear the president's words. They were more than a mile away, engaged in their pre-planned assault on this very building. This was a pre-planned assault, make no mistake, and that is a critical fact. Watch this.
Does anyone in this chamber honestly believe that but for the conduct of President Trump, that a charge in the article of impeachment, that attack at the Capitol would have occurred? Does anybody believe that?
It was not some sort of spontaneous decision by a bunch of, quote, protesters to go up to Capitol Hill and storm Capitol Hill. This was all planned out.
How much of it was planned? How much of this was strategized ahead of time?
They are getting indications, some evidence that they've seen that indicates that there was some level of planning.
There appears to be premeditation.
FBI internal report the day before the siege, warning of a violent war at the Capitol.
The FBI issued a warning of a, quote, war at the Capitol.
The FBI warned law enforcement agencies about this specific attack.
Be ready to fight. Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in.
We developed some intelligence that a number of individuals were planning to travel to the D.C. area with intentions to cause violence. We immediately shared that information.
And they pushed out that information through this JTTF structure.
It was immediately disseminated through a written product and briefed through our command post operations to all levels of law enforcement.
The FBI says 2 pipe bombs discovered near the Capitol on January 6th were placed there the night before.
New video appears to show a person suspected of planting pipe bombs near the U.S. Capitol the night before.
The FBI now says the bombs were planted the night before the Capitol siege between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m.
They were planted the day before.
All goes to the idea of premeditation and coordination among individuals.
This was a planned assault as if going after a castle.
So to answer the question of the House manager, does anybody believe that this would have occurred but for the speech from Donald Trump? I do. All of these facts make clear the January 6th speech did not cause the riots. The president did not cause the riots. He neither explicitly or implicitly encouraged the use of violence or lawless action, but in fact called for peaceful exercise of every American's First Amendment rights to peacefully assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. In other words, the Brandenburg Standard is not made out. The House managers admitted many facts are unknown. Even Speaker Pelosi admitted not knowing the real cause of the violence when she called for a 9/11-style commission to examine the facts and causes that led to the violence. On the screen is Speaker Pelosi's call for the 9/11 commission. Let's touch now on the second absurd and conflated allegation in the House manager's single article. President Trump's phone call to Georgia Secretary of State Ben Roethlisberger, surreptitiously recorded, by the way, included multiple attorneys and others on the call. Let me point out the very obvious fact that the House managers ignored. The private call that was made public by others cannot really be the basis to claim that the president intended to incite a riot, because he did not publicly disclose the contents of the call. How could he have hoped to use this call to invite his followers if he had no intent to make the conversation public and indeed had nothing to do with it being secretly recorded? The House managers told you that the president demanded that the Georgia Secretary of State, quote, find just over 11,000 votes. The word find, like so many others the House managers highlighted, is taken completely out of context. And the word find did not come out of thin air. Based on an analysis of publicly available voter data, that the ballot rejection rate in Georgia in 2016 was approximately 6.42%. And even though a tremendous amount of new first-time mail-in ballots were included in the 2020 count, the Georgia rejection rate in 2020 was a mere 0.4%, a drop-off from 6.42% to 0.4%. President Trump wanted the signature verification to be done in public. How can a request for signature verifications to be done in public be a basis for a charge for inciting a riot? With that background, it is clear that President Trump's comments and the use of the word "find" were solely related to his concerns with the inexplicable dramatic drop in Georgia's ballot rejection rates. Let's examine how the word "find" was used throughout that conversation. Mr. Trump's first use of the word "find" was as follows, quote, "We think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged. And we are quite sure that's going to happen." President Trump also used "find" as follows, quote, "Now, why aren't we doing signature, and why can't it be open to the public? And why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me the reason why, because I don't understand your reasoning. But someday you'll tell me the reason why. But why don't you want to find?" President Trump echoed his previous sentiments, again in the context of pursuing a legitimate and robust investigation into the lack of signature verification for mail-in and absentee ballots. Quote, "And why can't we have professionals do it instead of rank amateurs who will never find anything and don't want to find anything? They don't want to find anything, they don't want to find anything. They don't want to find, they don't want to find anything. Someday you'll tell me why, because I don't understand your reasoning, but someday you'll tell me why. But why don't you want to find? We can go through signature verification and we'll find hundreds of thousands of signatures, and you can let us do it. And the only way you can do it, as you know, is to go to the past. But you didn't do that in Cobb County. You just looked at one page compared to another. The only way you could do a signature verification is to go from one that signed it on November whatever, recently, and compare it to 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago, or even one. And you'll find that you have many different signatures. But in Fulton, where they dumped ballots, you will find that you have many that aren't even signed and that you have many forgeries." End quote. Mr. Trump continued to use the word "find" throughout the conversation. Each and every other time in the context of his request that Mr. Raffensperger undertake a review of signature verifications, and his concerns generally with ballot integrity and his reported electoral deficit, here are a few examples. Quote, "But why wouldn't you want to find the right answer, Brad? Instead of keep saying that the numbers are right, because those numbers are so wrong." Another example, quote, "We think that if you check the signatures, a real check of the signatures going back in Fulton County, you'll find at least a couple 100,000 of forged signatures of people who have been forged, and we are quite sure that's going to happen." End quote. Moreover, there was nothing untoward with President Trump, or any other candidate for that matter, speaking with the lead elections officer of a state. That's why the Georgia Secretary of State took a call along with members of his team, one of whom decided to record it and release it to the press. The only reason this conversation is being discussed in this chamber is because, once again, the media and their Democratic allies distorted the true conversation to mislead you and the American public. So we have a complete lack of evidence for the article of impeachment presented by the House managers. So why are we here? Politics. Their goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters.
Why bother with a Senate trial of Donald Trump? He's no longer president.
He'll be out of office anyway.
Is it to keep him from ever running again?
Make sure he can never run for office again.
Keep him from running for office again.
Donald Trump would not be able to run for office again.
Barring him from running for office again.
Disqualified from running for office.
Disqualify him from ever running from office again.
Disqualified from running for office again.
It's about focusing that he can never run again.
Remove him from ever running for office again.
Never be able to run for office again.
To ban former President Trump from running again.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
The goal is to eliminate a political opponent, to substitute their judgment for the will of the voters. Members of the Senate, our country needs to get back to work. I know that you know that. But instead, we are here. The majority party promised to unify and deliver more COVID relief. But instead, they did this. We will not take most of our time today, us of the defense, in the hopes that you will take back these hours and use them to get delivery of COVID relief to the American people. Let us be clear. This trial is about far more than President Trump. It is about silencing and banning the speech the majority does not agree with. It is about canceling 75 million Trump voters and criminalizing political viewpoints. That is what this trial is really about. It's the only existential issue before us. It asks for constitutional cancel culture to take over in the United States Senate. Are we going to allow canceling and banning and silencing to be sanctioned in this body? To the Democrats who view this as a moment of opportunity, I urge you instead to look to the principles of free expression and free speech. I hope truly that the next time you are in the minority, you don't find yourself in this position. To the Republicans in this chamber, I ask, when you are next in the majority, please resist what will be an overwhelming temptation to do this very same thing to the opposing party. Members of the Senate, this concludes the formal defense of the 45th President of the United States to the impeachment article filed by the House of Representatives. I understand that there is a procedure in place for questions, and we await them. Thereafter, we will close on behalf of President Trump. Mr. President, we yield the balance.
And I ask unanimous consent. We take a 15-minute recess.
Without objection, the Senate will stand in recess.
All right, things rocketing along at a rather quick pace as the president's defense presentation by his lawyers ends up being a little less than 3 hours of their allotted 16 hours. They had telegraphed going into today that they would make very short work of trying to essentially attack all of the House managers' characterizations and calling it a monstrous, preposterous lie this idea that the president somehow incited the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Let's go to Casey Hunt, who is on Capitol Hill. So, Casey, we are way, way ahead of schedule. How does this play out?
We are ahead of schedule, Lester, and a couple things I want to pick up on from the presentation that we just saw. One note, the attorney there tried to say that what happened on January 6th was not an insurrection under the definition. He walked through the legal definition of that and tried to suggest that it was something else. I think it's important to underscore that Mitch McConnell actually, after this happened, called it a failed insurrection in public. I think that's an important point to make. There has not been a lot of dispute about what happened, the way that the Trump team described it, and I think you're going to see that get some attention going forward. The other thing I would highlight, too, that stood out to those of us who were listening and who cover Capitol Hill every day is this quote about primary challenges. He said, no one in this chamber is anxious to have a primary challenge. That's one truism I think I can say with some certainty, but that's the way we operate in this country. And in a lot of ways, that really read like a threat, came across like a threat. And that is, of course, what the former president has been saying privately, threatening privately to do for many of these Republican senators. And that is one of the major motivating factors here as they have to go on record in public saying whether they want to convict or acquit him. But I'm not sure how that's really going across in the room, because it's something that I think will get senators' backs up. And I'm going to start asking about that as soon as they start to come out of the chamber and we have a chance to communicate a little bit more with them. But to pick up on your earlier point about the timing and what's going to happen now. So these are the question cards that that all of the senators have been handed, where they can fill out they fill out their name. They indicate whether their question is for the counsel, the defense counsel, or the House managers, and they write it on a card. They have been submitting these cards throughout the day today, and while we don't yet have official confirmation that that's what they're going to be doing this evening, Schumer just went to the majority leader just went to a break. It's widely expected right now that they are going to go to the question and answer period tonight. We're again waiting on official confirmation of that. But should they do that and finish the 4 hours of that tonight, that potentially sets up a final vote as soon as Saturday afternoon, which would be a pretty accelerated timetable. And I think it shows you just how anxious everyone is to move on from this. And it's different reasons on each side. Republicans obviously want to take the focus off of former President Trump, and many in the Senate don't believe that this is helpful for anyone. Democrats want to turn the focus to the now president, Biden, who is proposing a $1.9 trillion COVID rescue plan. So the motivation for that, and I will also add, Lester, they are supposed to be on vacation next week. Nobody wants to be here working on Sunday, and that is also a highly powerful, if human, motivating factor here in the Senate.
Yeah,
Lester.
I'd agree. That's a motivating factor for all of us. All right. Casey, thanks very much. Also with us is Chief Washington Correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, I'd like you to explore this idea of how many Republican votes for guilty would it take for Democrats to feel this was worthwhile?
Well, I think any more than 5 or 6, frankly, Lester, because, look, it's a pretty low bar now. They have gone into this with the idea that it was going to be very difficult ever since that first preliminary vote on the Rand Paul resolution, even before they got to the trial. So anything that they can get, any number that they can pick up, they will call that a victory, at least a Pyrrhic victory, because they are arguing for history. They're trying to argue, to the American people. They're trying to move the poll numbers, trying to damage Donald Trump's reputation by presenting what they think is very strong evidence that he should be disqualified from any future role in politics, in elective politics, and trying to hurt his ability to still be a presence from Mar-a-Lago or wherever going forward. So I think that they have pretty well conceded, as they've seen, the defense also folding their tents pretty early, that they don't feel that they're going to get a conviction. And at this point, they're looking to see whether any of those other Republican senators, one warning signal might be from Lisa Murkowski, whom they, I think, had been counting on, because she said earlier to some of the reporters in the hallway that she was more impressed at least with the defense presentation today than the other day. Now, of course, the other day was widely panned, so maybe that just means that it was a little better than a very bad presentation. But I was also struck today, Lester, by the way the defense is dismissing what happened in Georgia, the run-up to January 6th, the denial of the election of Joe Biden, and also the pressure on Georgia. Just we saw this week that the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, has opened a criminal investigation into whether or not that was illegal interference with the election and inciting or promoting election fraud by pressuring multiple officials in the Republican Party and elected officials, the Secretary of State and others, to change the vote by at least one vote. And the way he characterized that and read that transcript of that very damaging audio remains to be seen. But that is an active case, a criminal prosecution pending that, could be lodged against the president and others.
Yeah, this idea, he was talking about the president saying, find the votes. The
Right.
defense of that at times did feel perhaps a bit tortured. I want to bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson right now. Hallie, this has been being anxiously watched by Republicans everywhere. What kind of reaction? What are you hearing?
Yeah, so far, Lester, and I'll pick up on a thread after this, too, of what you and Andrew are just discussing. But so far, I think you are seeing it from what we have heard from some of the Senate Republicans, including one Republican senator not expected to vote against former President Trump, Ron Johnson, who thought that this was obviously a successful defense. In his view, that is something that's been picked up upon by some of the former president's defenders here. I think that you'll get more of a read on that as folks start to leave. But you even had, interestingly, Senator Lisa Murkowski, for example, a Republican who is not always known for going along with what the former president either wanted or his positions. She's been known to break away, applauding the defense so far. I think that gives you a bit of an indication as we head now into the Q&A, which it's always interesting. And you remember this, as I do, from the last impeachment trial of Donald Trump, the Q&A. You can read those tea leaves and see sort of which senators are leaning where, who's asking which questions to which side. Is much of a tell as anything in these kinds of trials. I will say, Lester, that when you look at what the defense team did there, what Bruce Castor laid out, he said and did a couple of things. So to pick up on what you and Andrew were talking about, this discussion of that call between former President Trump, then the president at the time, and the Georgia Secretary of State, this was stunning to a lot of people when that audio was revealed after the election, when Donald Trump said, I'm asking you to find the votes. And Bruce Castor reading that into the record in the impeachment trial, these quotes from Donald Trump, I find very interesting because the discussion that I had with sources all up until the trial began was that election fraud, these false claims of voter fraud that Donald Trump made were not going to be part of this defense. Why? For a couple of reasons. Number one, it's why the original defense team for Donald Trump left, basically parted ways with him, because based on what we have heard from sources, Donald Trump wanted them to make that a central theme of the arguments. Those attorneys said that's not going to hold water, and they couldn't come to an agreement. But secondly, because even the former president's Republican allies did not want that to be a central piece of these arguments at the trial. Yet here is Bruce Castor reading into the record pieces of that phone call. And we should note, Lester, it has been exhaustively fact-checked. You didn't hear that fact-checking in the chamber, but the things that Donald Trump was saying at the time simply were not true. Like the idea that signatures were being invented in some of these Georgia counties, that is just not accurate. It just didn't happen. And in fact, the point of this call was for the Secretary of State, perhaps not the point, but a function of the call, was for Secretary of State Raffensperger to push back on things that then President Trump was saying and to explain that is actually not correct. Here is the actual piece of it that's accurate. And we have been through that over the last month or so. The other piece of this, Castor referenced just in this last section here, he claimed that the House Democratic impeachment managers did not spend time trying to connect Donald Trump to what happened on January 6th. Although, as you know, Lester, that was largely the focus yesterday of the House Democratic impeachment managers' close, basically. The wrap-up, I should say, of their initial arguments was trying to connect the dots and draw that line between those two things. So I imagine that that's going to be a line of inquiry that you will see when we hit the Q&A portion, possibly in the next couple of minutes here.
All right, let's turn to our colleague, NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, where do you think the president's lawyers may have landed some punches, not knockout punches, but those that might turn Republican senators in the direction they want to go?
Well, look, I think by constantly making this a partisan political argument, I mean, that is what animates the Republican base. I think Mr. Castor bringing up the primary challenge wasn't an accident in his remarks. I think reminding them the political stakes here. So, you know, I don't know if to me, they did not do a very good job answering what was presented in the last 3 days. What they did do a good job of was ignoring it and just focusing on the shortest path to acquittal, which is make a hard partisan argument that you can defend to your base, you can go on Fox in primetime and defend, and close your ears to everybody else. So in that sense, it's a smart defense for what you have to do. But the questions that they didn't answer, you know, why didn't he try to stop this for a couple of hours? He didn't seem to do anything with Pence. And then to follow up on what Hallie said, you know, the problem they have with trying to distance former President Trump from the events of January 6th is he basically was the guy that saved the date for January 6th in his own Twitter feed that then convinced 2 other organizations to move their rallies to January 6th. He's essentially the organizer of the entire day of protest movement, and they just ignored it completely. This will come up in Q&A. I'll be very curious to see if they think they can continue to sort of pretend that didn't happen, because that's the weakest part of their defense and one of the stronger parts of the prosecution.
All right, Chuck, thanks very much. Let me turn now to NBC News political analyst and former Democratic Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill and NBC News political analyst and editor of the National Review, Rich Lowry. Claire, let me first ask your thoughts on picking up on what Chuck was saying there. Were there things that you saw, for example, of many of your colleagues becoming unwitting stars in this, talking about fighting and using inflammatory language? Were things that you saw that you think that they scored points with?
First of all, I don't think that the defense was trying to convince anyone of anything. I think the defense was trying to give Trump's supporters really good political talking points and to warn them about political consequences. And by that measure, I think their defense was a success. I think they gave Trump supporters good talking points, and they certainly warned them about primary challenges. But their credibility, I think, was damaged right off the bat when they just out and out lied about a number of things. The only reason this trial was delayed was because Mitch McConnell wanted it delayed. Everybody in the room knows it. There's no evidence that Antifa had anything to do with this riot. And finally, the last lie was they had all of the materials that were used by the House managers before this trial began, according to the rules that were set by Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. These were bipartisan rules. So I don't think that they obviously made any points with the Democratic side of the aisle, and I doubt they move very many people on the facts.
And Rich, we're hearing a lot of this, well, they used whataboutism again. Does whataboutism work, though?
It does to some extent politically. I think this was the most effective presentation, low bar, but the most effective argument by the defense, making the obvious points you would if you're trying to argue that, no, President Trump didn't directly incite or intend this violence to happen at the Capitol. The violence was probably planned before Donald Trump said anything on that morning. Some of the mayhem had already started before President Trump finished his speech by people who weren't listening to his speech, who were already at the Capitol. And he did issue, you know, in the context of things, pretty pro forma tweets saying stop this, but he did actually tweet a few of those. So the standard here, Lester, you know, conviction's not in play. Did they make Republicans feel a little better about a vote to acquit? Yeah, and I think by that standard was a success.
What do you make of how now President Biden made out in that tape in which we hear Democrats in the last election trying to oppose the certification? It is Joe Biden who's banging the gavel saying no, and essentially holding up the right for this process. What do you make of that?
Well, I do think it's a fair hit on the hypocrisy of some of these Democratic members. It's just wrong to use the process of certifying electors this way. But there you had Joe Biden standing up there doing his duty. And obviously the circumstances are much different. It's different, you know, a member of the House doing this and a president of the United States running a months-long campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the election and to use every means fair and foul to try to overturn the result. I think that's at the core the case against Trump. And again, I think Democrats made a mistake by over-relying on January 6th and his speech on January 6th rather than broadening out the case they actually wrote down in the article.
And then, Claire, what happens if in fact there is an acquittal? Where does that leave Republicans? Is this a case if you win the battle, but you've got your own internal war you've got to deal with?
Oh yeah, they've got a war. You can just see in the last 24 hours, Nikki Haley, I worry about whether or not she's in pain straddling the fence. There are a number of Republicans trying to decide whether or not they want to go back to the norms of principles of small government, conservative, free trade, all of those things, or if they want to stay in the Trump circus. And I think this trial may have hardened the lines within the Republican Party. And I agree with my friend Rich Lowry on this. I do think that no minds were changed today, but there are now talking points. And the other thing I agree with him is the difference between what Joe Biden did this time and what Mike Pence did this time is that we didn't have someone who lost the election trying to convince the country that our elections aren't fair. Every modern president has conceded except this one.
All right, Claire and Rich, thank you. Let's go to Chief White House Correspondent Kristen Welker. And speaking of President Joe Biden, what are you hearing, Kristen?
Well, Lester, we know that President Biden and this White House has been eager for this process to move forward expeditiously. And so I was just talking to a number of White House officials who have said that, look, the president is eyeing the end of this impeachment process and looking to intensify his push for COVID relief on the other side, something he is going to engage in next week. Now, what do we expect from President Biden over the weekend if, in fact, this process does come to a conclusion? Based on conversations with a number of administration officials, we anticipate that the president will put out some sort of written statement. Don't expect him to go before cameras. He's going to be at Camp David, his first trip to Camp David as president. And then next week, I am told he is going to really try to ramp up the push on his agenda. He has his first official trip out of Washington, D.C. He's going to be heading to Wisconsin for a town hall event. And then I'm told he's going to continue his outreach to state and local officials to try to build up support for his COVID relief package. Of course, there are a lot of details that they're still debating here within the Democratic Party, Lester, in order to get that passed through Congress. It does come, though, Lester, as this president has said that he's wanted to stay on the sidelines and stay focused on his agenda, but increasingly he has found himself weighing in. Yesterday, of course, I was in the Oval Office and I asked him about that newly released video that we saw earlier this week from House managers, and that's when President Biden made those remarks, essentially saying that he believes that video could change some minds. So going back to a point that Andrea made a few minutes ago, could we in fact see one or two more Republican senators vote to convict? That's something that we'll be watching for very closely. And then earlier today, he was out here on the North Lawn just behind me touring this Valentine's display that is up. And some reporters had the chance to ask him about the impeachment. He did weigh in, saying that he is anxiously awaiting what his Republican colleagues will do. Will they, quote, stand up? Those are his words. So, Lester, this attempt to try to stay focused on his agenda and to try to keep the focus there, but increasingly finding himself peppered with questions about something that is gripping the nation right now. His press secretary also saying that the president found the videos to be harrowing. So they await the conclusion to this process along with everyone else. I can tell you, I was just back in the press offices, and of course all of the TVs are trained on this very trial. So they are clearly watching and monitoring these developments quite closely, Lester.
All right, Kristen, thanks very much. Again, we are in a break. If you're just joining us, the president's lawyers have concluded their presentation using less than 3 hours to do so, a fraction of what they were allocated. Depending what happens at the end of this break, we may get a better sense of how quickly things will move from this point on, whether we could see an immediately move to questions from both sides, to both the prosecution and defense, and perhaps even as soon as tomorrow, a final vote on all this. But again, it remains to be seen. I don't want to get too far ahead of us. We're joined now by a veteran of the Justice Department and the Mueller investigation, NBC News legal analyst Andrew Weissman, and NBC News legal analyst Carol Lamb is a former U.S. attorney. Good to have you both with us. Andrew, let me begin with you. A lot of the arguments in the latter part of the defense presentation was the definition of incite, the definition of insurrection, saying that when you dismantle it, those things didn't exist. Is that the case?
I think that the defense left themselves very open to the questioning that's now going to happen on those issues. And I think that one thing that I think your viewers should sort of be prepared for is I think the Democrats are going to ask very pointed questions on, you say that but for the president, this still would have happened. Well, do you say that there's evidence, material evidence of election fraud? Are you saying that the president did not win the election, that is President Biden? If so, what is the evidence? And wasn't that what was the fire for the insurrection on January 6th? So I think there are going to be pointed questions about that. And on the issue of January 6th, I think that the defense did a very poor job on this issue of inciting. I think that there's going to be a lot of questions about what the president did not do. If his intent was really not to incite, there are going to be a lot of questions about why he wasn't immediately on the airways and on Twitter, immediately calling the National Guard. They really can't get around the timeline. And then finally, if they really want to essentially be saying what it is that the president, this is now President Trump, what he did or did not intend, why isn't he here testifying or at least submitting a letter or an affidavit? It's just like the first impeachment where the president is absent. So they're making representations about what Donald Trump might or might not have believed, but they actually had the opportunity to have him come and testify, and he didn't.
Carol, give me some questions that you would ask if you were challenging this defense presentation.
Yeah, I think this is an opportunity for the Democrats to do what the House managers don't have an opportunity to do on their own right now, which is to rebut some of the things that they heard earlier. Typically, in a trial, the prosecution would go first, then the defense would go, then the prosecution has another opportunity. So the Democratic senators are going to have to give those questions to the House managers to allow them to answer. I think there were, frankly, a couple of unforced errors that the House managers need to clean up about some of the pieces of evidence they put in and things like that. But I think overall, Andrew is correct. There needs to be more. There needs to be some questions to fill in the record again about why the president basically sat on his hands for a long time after the breach began, and what happened during that period of time. The House managers need to re-emphasize that again. These events were taking place only a mile and a half from where the president was. There's no excuse for an hour going by before the first tweet comes out. So I certainly think that needs to be filled in. I thought the whole presentation about the word find was frankly silly. One of the instructions you give to jurors is you don't check your common sense at the door. And when the president says, I want you to find a specific number of votes, he's using the word find in a very, very specific way. And that is not the way you typically use the word find. So I thought there was some overplaying on that ground.
All right, Carol and Andrew, thanks to both of you. Let me turn to NBC News political analyst Eugene Robinson, columnist and associate editor for the Washington Post. Eugene, good to see you. One of the things that was used in one of those tape montages were Democrats talking about the fact this would end in their hope is that Donald Trump would not be able to run again. It was used against them in this context, but what is the reality, no matter how this thing plays down? What is how is the political future of Donald Trump affected by this?
Well, that's a very good question. You saw Nikki Haley today sort of backing away from Donald Trump. Others are going to embrace him. You heard the threat, and I think it was just an explicit threat in Bruce Castor's summation of primary challenges to those who are insufficiently loyal to President Trump. I think he remains the principal actor in the Republican Party, no matter which way this vote goes, at least in the short term. Now, former president's influence tends to wane more quickly than they would like and more quickly than we realize at the time. I suspect that will happen to Trump too, but he's kind of in a unique position right now. He is the kingmaker and still the king. Just one other thing about the summation. We heard I think a preview of his potential criminal defense in Georgia with that business about the word find and what it means in that call with Brad Raffensperger. And because it's now under criminal investigation in Georgia. But I think that also sort of opened the door for the Democratic House managers to litigate the big lie about the election, which, the president's defense wasn't going to touch on, but did, in fact, touch on in that closing. And I think that opened the door for what is potentially some strong questioning by Democrats in this next phase.
I'm not sure I heard Mike Pence's name mentioned, and if it was, forgive me, but I don't think I heard it. Do you think that was something they really didn't want to touch, this idea of, as the president is tweeting about his vice president, his vice president is actually in reasonable fear of his life?
No, I think absolutely right. I think that omission was not by accident, because we now know that the president was aware that the vice president had to be evacuated from the Capitol. The situation was that serious. So why wasn't the president trying to do more to potentially save the life of his vice president? And again, that is the big hole in the defense is, if you did not intend to incite a riot, then why did you not try to stop the riot, try to stop the insurrection more quickly and more forcefully once it began? And they didn't offer an answer to that question, really, and it'll be interesting to see if they come up with one when they're questioned about it.
All right, Eugene, thanks. Also with us is Chief Washington Correspondent Andrew Mitchell. And Andrew, I think you want to pick up on that thought about what we didn't hear.
No, I think Eugene and Lester's, your conversation is exactly to the point. The fact that he did not mention, that the defense did not address the whole issue of Mike Pence, because the president, for all of those hours, was aware of it, as we know from what Senator Tuberville said, but also was tweeting attacks on Mike Pence. And what we've seen in the video is that the Mike Pence was really a rallying cry. Hang Mike Pence. A gallows was constructed outside the Capitol itself, on the grounds there, by the rioters. So that, and the fact that the defense cherry-picked statements from the president's January 6th speech, trying to, I think, mischaracterize the intent of the speech, whether or not it was for incitement was, of course, their contention, but also not dealing with all of those hours where he did nothing, not only regarding Mike Pence and his safety and attacking Mike Pence during that time, but did nothing to fulfill his constitutional requirement, his oath, to protect and secure the national security of the United States at home and abroad. He did not call the Pentagon. He did not call in for reinforcements. So there were so many instances during those 6 hours where his behavior was just really questionable, according to the House managers, but also according to any independent view of what was going on. Also, of course, the run-up, as you were just saying with Eugene, what happened in Georgia, the fact that that has now been opened up. I think that's what you're going to hear in these questions. The questions that are being presented, that will be presented by the House managers, are going to be to that very point. All of the incitement prior to January 6th, and as Chuck pointed out earlier, the fact that he actually moved the date to January 6th by calling for it to be on January 6th, that's when they, according to the testimony, changed their application for a permit. In fact, for the day when the Electoral College certification was to be ratified, all to the point of trying to overturn the election results that were clearly evident that Joe Biden had been elected, and that, belatedly at least, Mitch McConnell and others in the Senate Republican caucus were acknowledging. Lester.
All right, Andrew, let me bring in senior Washington correspondent Hallie Jackson. Hallie, as I was watching, I was ticking off some of the things that I knew would play well to the base. They brought up the media, Antifa, democratic hypocrisy, cancel culture, witch hunt, Elizabeth Warren, Hillary Clinton. Obviously, things that we know that play very strongly with the Republican base. Was that a lot of the goal? The audience outside those chambers?
Because the audience outside the chamber, Lester, is affecting the audience inside the chamber, right? Like it or not, as we've heard again and again, it's a political proceeding in many ways. And those specifically Republican senators, who are the ones who are the core audience here, because it does seem like Democrats know how they're going to vote on this to a large degree, they have constituents. And those constituents still support, in large part, speaking broadly about the Republican Party, Donald Trump. And you see that, Lester, in new polling. A new poll just out this week from CBS YouGov shows that 2/3 of Republican voters say it is still very important or somewhat important that the GOP continue to back Donald Trump. 71% say that a vote to convict the former president would be seen as disloyal to the party, a sign of disloyalty, not a sign of, for example, being able to stand up for whatever you may think is right. And so I think that those numbers give you a sense more broadly of where this party is. You heard Eugene talking about the comments from Nikki Haley that are out today that are making a lot of waves in the sort of beltway politicosphere, if you will. Nikki Haley, widely speculated to be a contender for 2024, talking very harshly about the former president, saying he has fallen so far, we should not have listened to him. But just 2 weeks ago, it was Nikki Haley appearing over on a different cable network saying, give the man a break, arguing against impeachment. You do have people like Karl Rove, for example, Senator Lisa Murkowski, who have suggested that there is no way that Donald Trump could have a political future now and could really realistically run again in 2024, although he is likely to continue to talk about it. But the numbers show you where the base is. I also want to draw your attention to something else, Lester. We've been looking, as we're having these conversations, if our viewers have seen on the right side of our screen, this is the area sort of outside on the Hill where reporters are talking with, you know, if they can, members of the Senate, any of the attorneys who walk by. There's a pool camera there. I don't know if that's live or tape of Chuck Schumer, but this is what we're talking about. If you notice, you saw Senator Lindsey Graham walk by. Our team on the Hill reports that Senator Graham, even just in these last couple of minutes, was conferring with the Trump defense team, or was seen inside that room with the Trump defense team. This is notable because, as Casey Hunt reported, Senators Graham, Lee, and Cruz talked with the defense team late yesterday. We know, based on the reporting that we have, that they were basically kicking around ideas, getting and giving advice, if you will, a signal that even as late as yesterday, there were some Republicans, allies of the former president, who were a little bit concerned about what they might see from this defense presentation today. It has concluded after 2 hours and 30 minutes, just by way of comparison, Lester. Obviously, this is a different trial than the first one, different time frames, different references. The defense in trial one, the first impeachment, went just about more than 9 hours during that first impeachment. This time, the defense felt like they made the points they needed to make. They want to, for lack of a better phrase, get this show on the road, because I think they have seen, and Republicans that I've talked to believe, that an acquittal is going to be at the end of this path, at least based on how things are going at the moment. As always, things could change, Lester.
All right, Hallie, let's go over to Casey Hunt right now on Capitol Hill. Casey, you were showing us earlier those cards in which the senators will submit their questions. To what extent are there any not deliberations, but conversations about what questions might be helpful to a particular side? Or is this strictly the senators on their own just asking what they want to know?
I think it's a little bit of both, Lester. And while you've seen both the defense and the prosecution in this trial give back some of their time, I think we've come to know that senators typically like to use all of the time that they have available to them for things like this. So I would be surprised if they don't use the full time here. And I'm interested to see if this is similar or different to how we saw it play out last time, and whether each side is looking to try to bolster their own case, or if they're trying to poke holes or ask additional questions about the other side. It's two different strategies. And some of the questions, I think, and this actually is a little bit of what Andrea Mitchell was hitting on just a minute or so ago, the big question that many of both Republicans and Democrats that I talked to is about what was President Trump doing while the riot was going on? Because there are only a handful of actual witnesses to that. There has been reporting about it. But the reality is the Trump team, if in fact that was going to be exculpatory, why did they not lay out more information about what he was doing in the course of their defense? And I think that's something that you're likely to see brought up throughout the course of this. I think there are also questions about what the president's mindset was like ahead of January 6th and some of those tweets that encouraged people to come. The other piece, of course, the moving of that permit that Andrea also referenced. What does the defense team know about that? I think that there are a lot of strictly facts here that could potentially contribute to the case one way or the other. And then, of course, the other interesting piece of this is who are the questions coming from? In the last trial, we ended up seeing questions from people, both that were on the partisan side and were trying to make a point one way or the other, but we also had some questions, for example, from Mitt Romney, from a couple other senators we were watching to see if they might vote back then to convict former President Trump on the charges he faced at that point. So I'm looking to see if any of these senators who may be considering a vote for conviction submit questions that are actually read on the floor. So we know that Romney submitted 5 questions. That's what he told us. And they have said that they're planning on releasing the questions that Romney submitted. Now, not every senator will need to do that, although if one of their questions is chosen to be read on the floor, their name will be attached to it. And they are going to group the questions together for efficiency. So if there are 2 or 3 senators who are asking a very similar question, that question could be read from multiple senators and asked on the floor. But if we start to see questions from people like Richard Shelby of Alabama, who's retiring. He's one of the Senate's last old bulls. I doubt we will get a question from the minority leader, Mitch McConnell. It would be a really big deal if we did. He is still really the person that we are watching the most closely as we look ahead to the vote tomorrow. Other senators who I saw grouped around McConnell's desk are the ones I'm following. Richard Burr of North Carolina. He's not running again and also faced some legal problems during the Trump administration, as he was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee that raised some questions about his relationship with the former president. People like Jerry Moran of Kansas, although I would also be surprised if he asked a question. So it's that group of people that I'm really looking to see if not only do they ask questions at all, but if so, are the questions antagonistic toward the former president at all, or are they searching for specific pieces of evidence or information that could contribute to a case? Lisa Murkowski is another one who had questions last time around, and I'm watching her too.
All right, well, here we go.
Resolution 47. The senators provide up to 4 hours during which senators may submit questions in writing directed either to the managers on the part of the House of Representatives or counsel for the former president. Majority Leader.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the answers within the 4-hour question period be limited to 5 minutes each. And if the questions are directed to both parties, the times be equally divided. Furthermore, that questions alternate sides for posing questions for as long as both sides have questions.
Without objection, is so ordered.
Mr. President, I have a question at the desk, for the desk.
The senator will submit it. The question from Senator Schumer and Senator Feinstein is directed to the House managers. The clerk will read it.
Isn't it the case that the violent attack and siege on the Capitol on January 6 would not have happened if not for the conduct of President Trump?
Of up to 5 minutes.
To answer your question very directly, Donald Trump summoned the mob. He assembled a mob and he lit the flame. Everything that followed was because of his doing. And although he could have immediately and forcefully intervened to stop the violence, he never did. In other words, this violent, bloody insurrection that occurred on January 6th would not have occurred but for President Trump. The evidence we presented at trial makes this absolutely clear. And this attack, as we said, didn't come from one random speech, and it didn't happen by accident, and that mob didn't come out of thin air. Before the election, Donald Trump spread lie after lie about potential fraud. An election, remember, that hadn't even happened yet. Months before the election took place, he was saying it was rigged, that it was going to be stolen. All to make his supporters believe that the only way he was going to lose is if the election was stolen, if the election was rigged. And when he did lose, he spent week after week inciting his supporters to believe that their votes had been stolen and that the election was fraudulent and that it was their patriotic duty to fight like hell to stop the steal and take their country back. And remember, this is in the United States where our vote is our voice. You tell somebody that an election victory is being stolen from them, that's a combustible situation. And he gave them clear direction on how to deal with that. For example, on December 19th, 18 days prior to January 6th, President Trump told them how and where to fight for it. He first issued his call to action for January 6th. This was a save the date sent 18 days before the event on January 6th. And it wasn't just a casual one-off reference or a singular invitation. For the next 18 days, he directed all of the rage he had incited to January 6th. And that was for him what he saw as his last chance to stop the transfer of power, to stop from losing the presidency. And he said things like, quote, fight to the death. And January 6th will be a, quote, wild and, quote, historic day. And this was working. They got the message. In the days leading to the attack, report after report, social media post after social media post confirmed that these insurgents were planning armed violence. But they were planning it because he had been priming them, because he had been amping them up. That's why they were planning it.
We're interrupting just for a few seconds so some of our stations can leave us for local coverage. For everyone else, we return you to the trial.
Insurgents were planning to carry weapons, including guns, to target the Capitol itself. And yet, Donald Trump, from January 5th to the morning of his speech, tweeted 34 times, urging his supporters to get ready to stop the steal. He even, on the eve of the attack, warned us that it was coming. He warned us that thousands were descending into D.C. and would not take it anymore. And when they got here at the Save America March, he told them again in that speech exactly what to do. His lawyer opened with, quote, let's have trial by combat. That was Rudy Giuliani. And Donald Trump brought that message home. In fact, he praised Rudy Giuliani as a fighter. And President Trump used the words fight or fighting 20 times in that speech. Remember, you've just told these people, these thousands of people, that somebody has stolen your election, your victory. You're not going to get the president that you love. Senators, that is an incredibly combustible situation when people are armed and they've been saying that they're mad as hell and they're not going to take it anymore. He looked out to a sea of thousands, some wearing body armor, helmets, holding sticks and flagpoles, some of which they would later use to beat Capitol Police, and told them that they could play by different rules. Play by different rules. He even at one point quite literally pointed to the Capitol as he told them to fight like hell. And after the attack, we've shown clearly, that once the attack began, insurgent after insurgent made clear they were following the president's orders. You saw us present that evidence of the insurgents who were there that day, who said, I came because the president asked me to come. I was here at his invitation. You saw that of the folks that were in the Capitol that day.
The time has expired. Are there further questions?
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina, have a question?
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Submit it.
I send a question to the desk on behalf of myself, Senator Cruz, Marshall, and Kramer to council.
Senator Graham for himself, Senator Cruz, Senator Marshall, and Senator Kramer submits a question for the counsel for Donald Trump. Clerk will read it.
Does a politician raising bail for rioters encourage more rioting?
Council has 5 minutes.
Yes.
Does council yield back the rest of their time? Council's time is yielded back. Are there other questions?
Mr. President.
The Senator from Georgia.
I have a question for the desk.
Send it to the desk. The Senator from Georgia, Senator Warnock, has a question for the House managers. Clerk will read the question.
Is it true or false that in the months leading up to January 6th, dozens of courts, including state and federal courts in Georgia, rejected President Trump's campaign's efforts to overturn his loss to Joe Biden?
House managers recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. President, Senators, that is true. That's true. I want to be clear, though, that we have absolutely no problem with President Trump having pursued his belief that the election was being stolen or that there was fraud or corruption or unconstitutionality. We have no problem at all with him going to court to do it. And he did, and he lost in 61 straight cases in federal court and state court, in the lowest courts in the land, in the U.S. Supreme Court. He lost it. He lost in courts in Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Minnesota, Nevada, and Wisconsin. All of them said the same thing. They couldn't find any corruption. They couldn't find any fraud, certainly nothing rising to a material level that would alter the outcome of any of the elections. And there was no unconstitutionality. That's the American system. And so, I mean, it's hard to imagine him having gotten more due process than that in pursuing what has come to be known popularly as the big lie, the idea that somehow the election was being stolen from him. And we have no problem with the fact that he went to court to do all those things. But notice, number one, the big lie was refuted, devastated, and demolished in federal and state courts across the land, including by 8 judges appointed by President Donald Trump himself. We quoted earlier in the case what happened in Pennsylvania, where U.S. District Court Judge Matthew Brand said, in the United States, the court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations. In the U.S., this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its 6th most populous state. Our people, laws, and institutions demand more. Then it went up to Judge Stefanos Bibas, who's a Trump appointee, who was a part of the appeals court panel. He said, the campaign's claims have no merit. The number of ballots it specifically challenges is far smaller than the 81,000 vote margin of victory, and it never claims fraud or that any votes were cast by illegal voters. Plus, tossing out millions of mail-in ballots would be drastic and unprecedented, disenfranchising a huge swath of the electorate and upsetting all of the down-ballot races, too, which incidentally weren't being challenged, even though it was the exact same ballot that had been brought. So the problem was when the president went from his judicial combat, which was fine, to intimidating and bullying state election officials and state legislators, and then finally, as Representative Cheney said, summoning a mob, assembling a mob, and then lighting the match for an insurrection against the Union. When he crossed over from nonviolent means, no matter how ridiculous or absurd, that's fine, he's exercising his rights, to inciting violence. That's what this trial is about. And we heard very little of that from the presentation of the president's lawyers. They really didn't address the facts of the case at all. There were a couple propaganda reels about Democratic politicians that would be excluded in any court in the land. They talked about the rules of evidence. All of that was totally irrelevant to the case before us. Whatever you think about it, it's irrelevant. And we'll be happy, of course, to address the First Amendment arguments too.
Mr. President.
The senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The question is from Senator Collins and Senator Murkowski. It is for the counsel for the former president. Clerk will read.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? What specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Clerk, read that question again. We're getting it back.
Exactly when did President Trump learn of the breach of the Capitol? And what specific actions did he take to bring the rioting to an end? And when did he take them? Please be as detailed as possible.
Mr. Van Veen.
The House managers have given us absolutely no evidence one way or the other onto that question. We're able to piece together a timeline, and it goes all the way back to December 31st, January 2nd. There is a lot of interaction between the authorities and getting folks to have security beforehand. On the day, we have a tweet at 2:38, so it was certainly sometime before then. With the rush to bring this impeachment, there's been absolutely no investigation into that. And that's the problem with this entire proceeding. The House managers did zero investigation, and the American people deserve a lot better than coming in here with no evidence, hearsay on top of hearsay on top of reports that are of hearsay. Due process is required here, and that was denied.
Mr. President.
And the senator from Nevada.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The senator from Nevada, Senator Rosen, submits a question for the House managers. And the clerk will read it.
On January 6th, the anti-Semitic Proud Boys group that President Trump had told to stand by laid siege to the Capitol alongside other rioters, including one wearing a Camp Auschwitz shirt. Is there evidence that President Trump knew or should have known that his tolerance of anti-Semitic speech, hate speech, combined with his own rhetoric, could incite the kind of violence we saw on January 6th?
Mr. President, Senators, Donald Trump has a long history of praising and encouraging violence, as you saw. He has espoused hateful rhetoric himself. He has not just tolerated it, but he's encouraged hateful speech by others. He has refused, as you saw in the September debate, that interview, to condemn extremist and white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. And he has, at every opportunity, encouraged and cultivated actual violence by these groups. Yes, he has encouraged actual violence, not just the word fight. He told groups like the Proud Boys, who had beaten people with baseball bats, to stand by. When his supporters in the 50-car caravan tried to drive a bus of Biden campaign workers off the road, he tweeted a video of that incident with fight music attached to it and wrote, "I love Texas." When his supporters sent death threats to the Republican Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia, he responded by calling Mr. Raffensperger an enemy of the state after he knew of those death threats. And in the morning of the 2nd Million MAGA March, when it erupted in violence and burned churches, he began that day with the tweet, "We have just begun to fight." I want to be clear that Donald Trump is not on trial for those prior statements. However, that hateful and violent and inappropriate they may be, but his statements, the president's statements, make absolutely clear 3 important points for our case. First, President Trump had a pattern and practice of praising and encouraging violence, never condemning it. It is not a coincidence that those very same people, Proud Boys, organizers of the Trump Caravan, supporters and speakers of the 2nd Million MAGA March, all showed up on January 6th to an event that he had organized with those same individuals who had organized that violent attack. Second, his behavior is different. It's not just that it was a comment by an official to fight for a cause. This is months of cultivating a base of people who were violent, not potentially violent, but were violent. And that prior conduct both helped him cultivate the very group of people that attacked us. It also shows clearly that he had that group assembled, inflamed, and all the public reports ready to attack. He deliberately encouraged them to engage in violence on January 6th. President Trump had spent months calling his supporters to a march on a specific day, at a specific time, for a specific purpose. What else were they going to do to stop the certification of the election on that day, but to stop you? But to stop you physically. There was no other way, particularly after his vice president said that he would refuse to do what the president asked. The point is this, that by the time he called the cavalry, not Calvary, but cavalry of his thousands of supporters on January 6th, an event he had invited them to, he had every reason to know that they were armed, violent, and ready to actually fight. He knew who he was calling and the violence they were capable of. And he still gave his marching orders to go to the Capitol and, quote, fight like hell to stop the steal. How else was that going to happen? If they had stayed at the ellipse, maybe it would have just been to violently in fight in protest with their words. But to come to the Capitol, that is why this is different, and that is why he must be convicted and acquitted. And disqualified.
Mr. President, on behalf of Senator Scott of South Carolina and myself, I'd like to submit a question to the desk.
Senator from Tennessee shall submit it. Thank you. The question is for counsel for the former president from Senators Haggerty and Scott of South Carolina. Clerk will read the question.
Given that more than 200 people have been charged for their conduct at the Capitol on January 6th, that our justice system is working to hold the appropriate persons accountable, and that President Trump is no longer in office, isn't this simply a political show trial that is designed to discredit President Trump and his policies and shame the 74 million Americans who voted for him?
Thank you, Senators, for that question. That's precisely what the 45th President believes this gathering is about. We believe in law and order and trust that the federal authorities that are conducting investigations and prosecutions against the criminals that invaded this building will continue their work and be as aggressive and thorough as we know them to always be, and that they will continue to identify those that entered the inner sanctum of our government and desecrated it. The 45th president no longer holds office. There is no sanction available under the Constitution, in our view, for him to be removed from office that he no longer holds. The only logical conclusion is that the purpose of this gathering is to embarrass the 45th president of the United States and in some way try to create an opportunity for senators to suggest that he should not be permitted to hold office in the future, or at the very least, publicize this throughout the land to try to damage his ability to run for office when and if he is acquitted, and at the same time, tell the 74 million people who voted for them that their choice was the wrong choice. I believe that this is a divisive way of going about handling impeachment, and it denigrates the great solemnity that should attach to such proceedings. I yield the remainder of my time, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I send a question to the House managers to the desk because the President's lawyers did not answer the question.
The Senator will send the question. Debate's not allowed. The question is from Senator Markey with Senator Duckworth to the manager of the part of the House Representatives. The clerk will read the question.
Exactly when did the president learn of the breach at the Capitol, and what steps did he take to address the violence? Please be as detailed as possible.
Just wish to respond.
Mr. President, Senators, this attack was on live TV, on all major networks in real time. The president, as president, has access to intelligence information, including reports from inside the Capitol. He knew the violence that was underway, he knew the severity of the threats, and most importantly, he knew the Capitol Police were overwhelmingly outnumbered and in a fight for their lives against thousands of insurgents with weapons. We know he knew that. We know that he did not send any individuals. We did not hear any tweets. We did not hear him tell those individuals, stop. This is wrong. You must go back. We did not hear that. So what else did the president do? We are unclear. But we believe it was a dereliction of his duty. And that was because he was the one who had caused them to come to the Capitol, and they were doing what he asked them to do. So there was no need for him to stop them from what they were engaged in. But one of the things I would like to ask is we still have not heard and posed to you all the questions that were raised by Mr. Raskin, Manager Raskin, in his closing argument. Why did the President Trump not tell the protesters to stop as soon as he learned about it? Why did President Trump do nothing to stop the attack for 2 hours after the attack began? Why did President Trump do nothing to help protect the Capitol and law enforcement battling the insurgents? You saw the body cam of a Capitol police officer at 4:29, still fighting. 4:29 after, since what time? 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Why did he not condemn the violent insurrection on January 6th? Those are the questions that we have as well. And the reason this question keeps coming up is because the answer is nothing.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Utah.
I send a question to the desk.
The Senator from Utah, Mr. Romney, on behalf of himself and Senator Collins. It's a question, and the clerk will read it. Oh, and I apologize. The question is for both sides, so the time will be evenly divided.
When President Trump sent the disparaging tweet at 2:24 p.m. regarding Vice President Pence, was he aware that Vice President had been removed from the Senate by the Secret Service for his safety?
The House Manager. And time will be evenly divided between. Of course, would the clerk read the question again?
When President Trump sent the disparaging tweet at 2:24 p.m. regarding Vice President Pence, was he aware that the Vice President had been removed from the Senate by the Secret Service for his safety?
The House of Representatives managers are recognized 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. Well, let me tell you what he said at 2:24 p.m. He said Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution. The USA demands the truth. And you know by now what was all over the media. You couldn't turn on the television, couldn't turn on the radio, couldn't consume any media, or probably take any phone calls or anything else without hearing about this, and also hearing about the Vice President. And here's what Donald Trump had to know at that time, because the whole world knew it, all of us knew it. Live television had, by this point, shown that the insurgents were already inside the building, and that they had weapons, and that the police were outnumbered. And here are the facts that are not in dispute. Donald Trump had not taken any measures to send help to the overwhelmed Capitol Police. As president, at that point, when you see all this going on and the people around you are imploring you to do something, and your vice president is there, why wouldn't you do it? Donald Trump had not publicly condemned the attack, the attackers, or told them to stand down, despite multiple pleas to do so. And Donald Trump hadn't even acknowledged the attack. And after Wednesday's trial portion concluded, Senator Tuberville spoke to reporters and confirmed the call that he had with the president and did not dispute Manager Cicilline's description in any way that there was a call between he and the president around the time that Mike Pence was being ushered out of the chamber. And that was shortly after 2 p.m. And Senator Tuberville specifically said that he told the president, Mr. President, they just took the vice president out. I've got to go. That was shortly after 2 p.m. There were still hours of chaos and carnage and mayhem. The vice president and his family were still in danger at that point. Our commander-in-chief did nothing.
Counsel for the former president.
The answer is no. At no point was the president informed the vice president was in any danger, because the House rushed through this impeachment in 7 days with no evidence. There is nothing at all in the record on this point, because the House failed to do even a minimum amount of due diligence. What the president did know is that there was a violent riot happening at the Capitol. That's why he repeatedly called via tweet and via video for the riots to stop, to be peaceful, to respect Capitol Police and law enforcement, and to commit no violence, and to go home. But to be clear, this is an article of impeachment for incitement. This is not an article of impeachment for anything else. It's a one count. They could have charged anything they wanted. They chose to charge incitement. So that the question, although answered directly no, it's not really relevant to the charges for the impeachment in this case. And I just wanted to clear up one more thing. Mr. Castro, in his first answer, may have spoke, but what he said was Mr. Trump had said, fight to the death. That's false. I'm hoping he misspoke. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, on behalf of myself and Senators Casey and Brown, I send a question to the desk.
It's a question from Senator Klobuchar, Senator Casey, Senator Brown to the House managers. The clerk will report.
In presenting your case, you relied on past precedents from impeachment trials, such as William Belknap's impeachment. After what you have presented in the course of this trial, if we do not convict former President Trump, what message will we be sending to future presidents and Congresses?
President Trump engaged in a course of conduct that incited an armed attack on the Capitol. He did so while seeking to overturn the results of the election and thwart the transfer of power. And when the attack began, he further incited violence aimed to his own vice president, even as demonstrated his state of mind by failing to defend us and the law enforcement officials who protect us. The consequences of his conduct were devastating on every level. Police officers were left overwhelmed, unprotected. Congress had to be evacuated. Our staff barricaded in this building, calling their families to say goodbye. Some of us, like Mr. Raskin, had children here. And these people in this building, some of whom were on the FBI's watch list, took photos, stole laptops, destroyed precious statues, including one of John Lewis, desecrated the statue of a recently deceased member of Congress who stood for nonviolence. This was devastating. And the world watched us. And the world is still watching us to see what we will do this day, and we'll know what we did this day 100 years from now. Those are the immediate consequences, and our actions will reverberate as to what are the future consequences. The extremists who attacked the Capitol at the president's provocation will be emboldened. All our intelligence agencies have confirmed this. It is not House managers saying that. There are quite literally standing by and standing ready. Donald Trump told them this is only the beginning. They are waiting and watching to see if Donald Trump is right that everyone said this was totally appropriate. Let me also bring something else up. I'll briefly say that defense counsels put a lot of videos out in their defense, playing clip after clip of Black women talking about fighting for a cause or an issue or a policy. It was not lost on me as so many of them were people of color and women, and Black women like myself, who are sick and tired of being sick and tired for our children, your children, our children. This summer, things happened that were violent, but there were also things that gave some of us Black women great comfort. Seeing Amish people from Pennsylvania standing up with us, members of Congress fighting up with us. And so I thought we were past that. I think maybe we're not. There are long-standing consequences, decisions like this that will define who we are as a people, who America is. We have in this room made monumental decisions. You all have made monumental decisions. We've declared wars, passed civil rights acts, ensured that no one in this country is a slave. Every American has the right to vote. unless you live in a territory. At this time, some of these decisions are even controversial, but history has shown that they define us as a country and as a people. Today is one of those moments, and history will wait for our decision.
Mr. President?
The Senator from Utah.
I send a question to the desk.
The Senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, sends a question on behalf of himself, Senator Hawley, Senator Crapo, Senator Blackburn, Senator Portman. And the question is for the counsel for the former president. Clerk will read.
Multiple state constitutions enacted prior to 1787, namely the constitutions of Delaware, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, specifically provided for the impeachment of a former officer. Given that the framers of the U.S. Constitution would have been aware of these provisions, does their decision to omit language specifically authorizing the impeachment of former officials indicate that they did not intend for our Constitution to allow for the impeachment of former officials?
Good question. And the answer is yes, of course they left it out. The framers were very smart men, and they went over draft after draft after draft on that document. And they reviewed all the other drafts of all of the state constitutions, all of them. And they picked and chose what they wanted, and they discarded what they did not. And what they discarded was the option for all of you to impeach a former elected official. I hope that's answering your question. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The Senator from California.
Mr. President, I send a question to the desk.
The Senator from California submits a question for the House managers. The clerk will report.
Having been on the front lines of combating the big lie over the past 4 years as California's chief elections officer, it is clear that President Trump's plot to undermine the 2020 election was built on lies and conspiracy theories. How did this plot to unconstitutionally keep President Trump in power lead to the radicalization of so many of President Trump's followers and the resulting attack on the Capitol?
Senators, Donald Trump spent months inciting his base to believe that their election was stolen. And that was the point, that was the thing that would get people so angry. Think about that. What it would take to get a large group of thousands of Americans so angry to storm the Capitol. That was the purpose behind Donald Trump saying that the election had been rigged and that the election had been stolen. And to be clear, when he says the election is stolen, what he's saying is that the victory, and he even says one time, the election victory is being stolen from them. Think about how significant that is to Americans. Again, you're right, over 70 million, I think 74 million people voted for Donald Trump. And this wasn't a one-off comment. It wasn't one time. It was over and over and over and over and over again with a purpose. And we're not having this impeachment trial here because Donald Trump contested the election. As I said during the presentation, nobody here wants to lose an election. We all run our races to win our elections. But what President Trump did was different. What our commander-in-chief did was the polar opposite of what we're supposed to do. We let the people decide the elections, except President Trump. He directed all of that rage that he had incited to January 6th, the last chance. That's this, again, to him, this was his last chance. This was certifying the election results. He needed to whip up that mob, amp them up enough to get out there and try to stop the election results, the certification of the election. And y'all, they took over the Senate chamber to do that. They almost took over the House chamber. There were 50 or so or more House members who were literally scared for their lives up in the gallery. A woman who bought into that big lie died because she believed the president's big lie. This resulted in a loss of one of his supporters' lives. A Capitol police officer died that day. Other of President Trump's supporters. 2 Capitol police officers ended up taking their own lives. Defense counsel, their defense is basically everything President Trump did is okay, and he could do it again. Is that what we believe? That there is no problem with that? That it's perfectly fine if he does the same thing all over again? This is dangerous. He's inciting his base. He was using the claim of a rigged election. We have never seen somebody do that over and over and over again, tell a lie, say 6 months ahead of time that it's a rigged election. There is a dangerous consequence to that. When you've got millions of followers on Twitter and millions of followers on Facebook, and you've got that huge bully pulpit from the White House, and you're the President of the United States, there is a cost to doing that. People are listening to you in a way that, quite honestly, they're not listening to me, and they're not listening to all of us in this room. You know, I just want to clear up, the defense counsel made a point about something that I read earlier. The defense counsel suggested I misspoke. And I just want to clarify for the record that the tweet I referenced, let me read you the tweet directly. If a Democrat presidential candidate had an election rigged and stolen with proof of such acts at a level never seen before, the Democrat senators would consider it an act of war and fight to the death. Mitch and the Republicans do nothing, just want to let it pass. No fight. So Donald Trump was equating what Democrats would do if their election was stolen. He said they'd fight to the death. Why do you think he sends that tweet? Because he's trying to say, hey, the other side would fight to the death, so you should fight to the death. I mean, do we read that any other way?
Mr. President,
the senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, on my behalf and on behalf of Senator Kramer, I send a question to the desk.
Senator Hawley, on behalf of himself and Senator Kramer, send a question for the council and House manager. And following our procedure, the first one to respond will be, after it's read, will be the counsel for the former president.
If the Senate's power to disqualify is not derivative of the power to remove a convicted president from office, could the Senate disqualify a sitting president but not remove him or her? If the Senate's power to disqualify is not derivative of the power to remove a convicted president from office, could the Senate disqualify a sitting president but not remove him or her?
President has 2.5 minutes.
No. But I can't let this rest. Mr. Castro attributed a statement the time before last that he was up here that Donald Trump had told his people to fight to the death. I'm not from here. I'm not like you guys. I was being very polite and given an opportunity to correct the record, and I thought that's exactly what he would do. But instead, what he did is he came up and illustrated the problem with the presentation of the House case. It's been smoke and mirrors, and worse, it's been dishonest. He came up and tried to cover when he got caught, as they were caught earlier today with all of the evidence, checking tweets, switching dates, everything they did. And bear in mind, I had 2 days to look at their evidence. And when I say 2 days, I mean they started putting in their evidence, so I started to be able to get looking at it. That is not the way this should be done. But what we discovered was he knew what he was doing. He knew that the president didn't say that to his people. What he said was, if it happened to the Dems, this is what they would do. In his speech that day, you know what he said? He said, if this happened to the Democrats, if the election was stolen from the Democrats, all hell would break loose. But, he said to his supporters, we are smarter, we are stronger, and we're going to do what they did all summer long. So what he did was he misrepresented a tweet to you to put forth the narrative that is wrong. It's wrong, it's dishonest, and the American people don't deserve this any longer. You must acquit.
Managers on the part of the House of Representatives have 2.5 minutes.
And that was profoundly inaccurate and irrelevant to what the question is. So I'm going to get back to the question. So under Article 2, Section 4, a president who is in office must be convicted before removal. then must be removed before disqualification. Okay. But if the president is already out of office, then he can be separately disqualified, as this president is. But these powers have always been treated as separate, which is why I think there have been 8 people who've been convicted and removed, and just 3 of them disqualified. And as you know, there's a totally separate process within the Senate for doing this. The Constitution requires 2/3 vote for conviction, but for disqualification, it's a majority vote. It's a separate thing. So people could vote to convict and then vote not to disqualify if they felt that the evidence demonstrated that the president was guilty of incitement to insurrection. They could vote to convict, but if they felt that they didn't want to exercise the further power established by the Constitution to disqualify, they wouldn't have to do that, and that could be something that's taken up separately by the Senate by majority vote.
Mr. President? All right, they are well into the question and answer phase. Again, everything has been sped up because the defense team only used a very small amount of their time for the presentation, so we're well into what is, as you can obviously see, the question and answer period, perhaps one of the more political aspects of what is ultimately a political trial. Let me bring in NBC News political director and moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, and Chief Washington correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Chuck, walk us through this day and where this looks like it's leading.
Well, look, the president's defense team decided to make a very hard partisan argument, basically a cable TV argument, and it may be successful. And you see during this question and answer period, they're sort of sticking to this, make it a red-blue fight, make it about polarization, try to make this as political as possible, and I think give Republican senators who are more nervous about the political impact of this something to hang their hat on. Look, again, we go back to what we've said a million times before, Lester. In a real courtroom, this defense argument would be a disaster. Normal jury, I think, would have been swayed or moved by them. But they made a hard partisan political argument, and it may be just enough for those senators that are thinking about the short-term political impact of Donald Trump rather than potentially the long-term impact on the democracy of Donald Trump.
Andrea, does it seem that the prosecutors are cleaning up whatever damage they may have received from the defense presentation?
Well, they're trying to, and they had a little help in this regard from a couple of Republican senators, not surprisingly, Romney, Collins, and Murkowski, asking, when did the president know that the Capitol had been breached? They wanted to know, when did he know that the vice president was in danger? And did he know that before or after his tweet at 2:24 making disparaging remarks about the vice president? Yeah, so not surprisingly, they are at least focused on the safety of the vice president and the pretty shocking reality that the president, whom we know had been informed by Senator Tuberville, had acknowledged that around 2:15 he had informed the president that the vice president had been taken out and was in danger. Well, the defense didn't even address that. They said that the House managers, he said incorrectly, the House managers had never addressed it and said that this was another example of how they had rushed the case. But they simply did not respond to it, so they have still not addressed that key fact of why he did not stop the violence, why he, during all those hours, did not say anything, and in fact was tweeting, continuing to praise the rioters and to attack his own vice president.
And so, Casey, we're about, what, an hour into the Q&A, maybe a little less. How much more of this is left, and then what are the steps that lead up to the final vote?
Sure. Well, this is 4 hours in total, Lester, and then we'll hear additional closing arguments ahead of a final vote that we anticipate is likely to happen tomorrow afternoon, Saturday. But just to pick up on what Andrea was saying there, I think that this is an absolutely critical point here. If the defense team wanted to tell us what Trump knew and when he knew it, they could ask him. They are his defense team, and they clearly have decided, no, we're going to argue this is not relevant. One quick note also that I would say, I was in the chamber as they were starting to ask these questions, and just so far, there's nothing that's happened that has surprised us. Questions that have gotten to these questions of facts have come from either Democrats or Republicans who we knew were likely to vote to convict, Senator Romney, Senator